The buzzards circled overhead in lazy, ominous spirals. Thomas Blackwood pulled his worn cavalry hat lower against the merciless Arizona sun, his weathered face creasing with familiar lines of caution. His horse, a sturdy chestnut mare named Whiskey, snorted and pawed at the cracked earth, sensing her rider's unease. The year was 1867, and the Arizona Territory stretched before them like an ocean of dust and thorns, indifferent to the small dramas of human existence. Thomas had been a rider for the Postal Service for nearly 3 years now, carrying mail and small packages between scattered mining camps. The isolation suited him. At 38, his face looked like leather that had been left too long in the desert sun, deep lines carved around steel gray eyes that had seen too much. His hands, rough and calloused, bore the scars of both war and wilderness. He reached for his canteen, taking a measured sip of lukewarm water. 3 days alone on this route with nothing but whiskey and the endless sky for company. Sometimes he'd go a week without hearing another human voice, and he'd begun talking to his horse just to remember what his own voice sounded like. "What do you think, girl?" he asked, scanning the horizon. "Something's not right out there." The buzzards continued their patient circling like dark thoughts that wouldn't disperse. In Thomas's experience, where there were buzzards, there was death. And in this unforgiving landscape, death rarely came peacefully. He should ride on. Whatever lay ahead wasn't his business. The mail pouch at his side carried letters from husbands to wives, from children to parents, promises and hopes that needed to be delivered. That was his job now, not saving people, not making impossible choices, just delivering words across the wilderness, then moving on. Yet something pulled him toward those circling birds. Thomas sighed, adjusting the Colt revolver at his hip, a habit born from years of caution. "Come on, Whiskey. Let's see what's caught their attention." As they approached, the dark shape on the horizon gradually took form, a wooden post thick as a man's arm, driven deep into the desert floor. Someone had put considerable effort into placing it here, miles from any settlement or trail. The wood was weathered gray, but sturdy, as if it had been there for weeks. Thomas reined in Whiskey about 50 yards away, studying the scene. His hand instinctively moved to rest on his revolver. The desert was full of stories about travelers who'd been careless and paid with their lives. But there was something else, a splash of color at the base of the post, that didn't match the browns and tans of the surrounding landscape. Blue fabric, faded and torn. "Hello?" Thomas called, his voice cracking from disuse. The sound seemed swallowed by the vast emptiness. No answer came except the distant cry of a hawk joining the buzzards overhead. Whiskey shifted nervously beneath him, ears flicking forward then back. Animals sense things humans missed, and her behavior told Thomas to approach with caution. He dismounted slowly, boots hitting the ground with a soft thud. The leather of his saddle creaked as he took his shovel from its straps. If someone had died out here, the least he could do was give them a proper burial. He'd seen too many men left to the elements during the war. As he approached on foot, spurs jingling softly with each step, the smell hit him first. Not the sharp stench of death he'd expected, but something almost worse. The sour odor of fear and desperation. Human sweat mixed with dust and something else he couldn't quite identify. The blue fabric was a child's dress. Thomas's pace quickened. A child out here, alone, the thought twisted something deep inside him. At the base of the post, he found a small form slumped against the wood hands, bound behind with rope. For a terrible moment, he thought he was too late. Then the child's chest rose with a shallow breath. Thomas dropped to his knees, setting aside his shovel. It was a little girl no more than 8 years old, with tangled brown hair that hung limply around a dirt-streaked face. Her dress, once a pretty blue, was now faded and stained. Her wrists were bound to the post with professional knots, the hemp rope cutting into her skin. But it was the sign hanging around her neck that made Thomas's blood run cold. A wooden board roughly cut and hung with a leather cord. Someone had burned words into the wood with a hot iron, each letter seared deep in black, "Not worth feeding." "My God," Thomas whispered, his voice barely audible. The girl's eyes fluttered open at the sound, revealing irises the color of spring grass. Those eyes held a mixture of hope and terror that cut straight through Thomas's chest. When she tried to speak, only a harsh whisper emerged. "Water," she managed. "Please." Thomas fumbled for his canteen with shaking hands. He'd seen terrible things during the war, men torn apart by cannon fire fields littered with bodies, but this deliberate cruelty toward a child struck him in a place he thought had long since hardened. Easy now, Thomas said, his voice gentler than it had been in years. I've got you. You're safe. He held the canteen to her cracked lips, letting her drink in small sips. Too much water too quickly would make her sick after such deprivation. As she drank, he worked to untie the ropes around her wrists, his fingers moving with careful precision. What's your name? Thomas asked as the last of the knots came free. Eleanor Miller, she whispered, her voice like dry leaves. But everyone calls me Ellie. The name Miller struck Thomas like a physical blow. His hands froze on the rope. Miller, he repeated, studying her face more carefully now. Those eyes, he knew those eyes. Your father, was his name James Miller? Ellie nodded weakly, confusion crossing her features. You knew my pa? A rush of memories flooded Thomas's mind. James Miller's face laughing around a campfire. James leading a charge across an open field. James lying broken beside a destroyed dam, rain mixing with blood as he gasped his final words. Thomas swallowed hard. A long time ago, during the war. When he finally freed her hands, Ellie winced as blood returned to her fingers. Thomas gently removed the cruel sign from around her neck, intending to throw it away, but something made him turn it over. On the back, scratched into the wood, with what must have been a knife point, were words that sent a chill through his body. For Thomas Blackwood, if you find her, his name. This wasn't random. This wasn't a chance encounter in the vastness of the Arizona territory. Someone, William Miller, James's older brother, had left this child here knowing Thomas's postal route, knowing he would find her. This was deliberate. This was revenge. Thomas quickly tucked the sign into his saddlebag away from Ellie's sight. The girl didn't need to know about this darkness, not yet. How long have you been out here? He asked, trying to keep his voice steady. 3 days, I think, Ellie said, her small frame shivering despite the heat. Pa said there wasn't enough food for both of us after Ma died. Said I reminded him too much of her. Said maybe someone would find me who could take better care of me. The casual cruelty of it took Thomas's breath away. A father abandoning his own child because she was inconvenient, because she was not worth feeding. The words on that sign weren't just cruel, they were a father's final judgment on his own daughter. Your mother died, Thomas asked gently, helping Ellie to her feet. She swayed and he quickly caught her before she collapsed. Fever took her last winter, Ellie whispered against his shirt. After that, Pa started drinking more. Said everything reminded him of Ma, and it hurt too much. Said I looked just like her. Thomas lifted her, carefully, surprised by how little she weighed. She couldn't be more than 50 pounds, all bones and fragile courage. Her head fell against his shoulder, and he could feel her small body trembling with exhaustion and relief. As he carried her back to his horse, Thomas's mind raced with questions and possibilities. He'd been planning to ride straight through to Mineral Springs, deliver his mail, and move on to the next settlement. A simple life with simple responsibilities. But now everything had changed. Whiskey whickered softly as they approached, as if the horse understood that their journey had suddenly become something much more complicated. Ellie weighed almost nothing in his arms, but Thomas could feel the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like a heavy cloak. Can you ride? Thomas asked, studying Ellie's pale face. She nodded weakly. I rode with Pa sometimes. Before Ma died, Thomas helped her onto Whiskey's back, then swung up behind her. The girl sat rigid at first, clearly uncomfortable with the closeness to a stranger of her, but as they began moving across the desert, she gradually relaxed against his chest. The rhythm of the horse's gait seemed to soothe her. Dark clouds were building on the horizon, towering thunderheads that promised rain, but also danger. Lightning storms in the desert could be deadly, especially for travelers caught in the open. Thomas urged Whiskey into a faster trot, hoping to reach shelter before the weather turned. Where are we going? Ellie asked, her voice muffled against his shirt. Silver Creek, Thomas replied. It's a small town about 15 miles east. They'll have a doctor there who can look at you. What he didn't say was what would happen after that. What does one do with an abandoned child in a territory where survival was difficult enough for able-bodied adults? Orphanages were few and far between, and those that existed were often little more than workhouses for unwanted children. Did Pa say anything else? Thomas asked carefully, not wanting to upset her further but needing to know more about William Miller's intentions. When he left you, Ellie was quiet for a long moment. He said it was justice, said some debts had to be paid. I didn't understand what he meant. She tilted her head back to look up at Thomas. Were you and Pa friends in the war? Thomas's throat tightened. How could he explain to this child that her uncle had died under his command, that he, Thomas, had made a decision that saved many lives, but cost James his? We served together, he said finally, the simplest truth he could offer. They rode in silence after that, the only sounds the steady rhythm of Whiskey's hooves and the distant rumble of thunder. The storm was getting closer, and Thomas could smell rain on the wind. He scanned the landscape ahead, looking for any kind of shelter. About 5 miles from where they'd started, Thomas spotted a rocky outcropping that would provide some protection. It wasn't much, just a shallow overhang in a cliff face, but it would have to do. He guided Whiskey toward the rocks as the first fat raindrops began to fall. They dismounted just as the sky opened up, rain pouring down in sheets, turning the dry earth into mud within minutes. Lightning split the sky in brilliant white forks, followed by crashes of thunder that echoed off the canyon walls. Thomas unsaddled Whiskey and rubbed her down with a piece of cloth from his saddlebags. The horse seemed nervous about the storm, but settled once she was under the overhang. Ellie sat on a flat rock, watching the rain with wide eyes. I've never seen so much water at once, she said wonderingly. Thomas pulled jerky and hardtack from his supplies and offered them to her. She ate slowly as if she couldn't quite believe the food was real. Her manners were careful and precise, the kind that came from a mother's teaching rather than a father's neglect. Tell me about your mother, Thomas said, hoping to distract her from the storm and her recent ordeal. Ellie's face brightened for the first time since he'd found her. Ma was wonderful. She could make anything grow, even in our little yard in Tucson. We had tomatoes and beans and even some flowers. Her voice took on a sing-song quality as if reciting a cherished memory. She said flowers weren't practical, but they made life prettier. Thomas nodded, remembering James Miller speaking of his sister-in-law with fondness. She sounds like a special lady. But she taught me my letters and numbers too. Ellie continued, warming to the subject. Said a girl should know how to read and cipher as well as any boy. She was right about that. Thomas agreed, impressed by how articulate the child was despite her ordeal. Can you read well? Ellie nodded proudly. Ma had 3 books, the Bible, a book of poetry, and Robinson Crusoe. I've read them all twice. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside their small shelter, Thomas found himself drawn into conversation with this remarkable child. She asked thoughtful questions about the desert, about his work, about the world beyond the small corner of it she'd known. As evening approached and the storm showed no signs of abating, Thomas made a small fire near the mouth of their shelter, careful to keep the smoke blowing outward. The dancing flames cast moving shadows on the rock walls, and the warmth was welcome as the desert temperature dropped with nightfall. Ellie sat close to the fire, her knees drawn up to her chest. In the flickering light, she looked even smaller, more vulnerable. Yet there was a resilience in her that Thomas couldn't help but admire. Most grown men would have broken under what she'd endured. Mr. Blackwood, she said suddenly, breaking a comfortable silence, do you know why Pa left me that way? With that sign. Thomas tensed, unsure how to answer. The truth was too cruel, too complex for a child to bear. Yet he sensed that Ellie had seen enough of life's harshness to recognize a lie, however well-intentioned. Sometimes, he began carefully, when people lose someone they love, their grief can turn into something ugly. They look for someone to blame. He blamed me for Ma dying, Ellie said with a child's directness. But I didn't make her sick. Of course you didn't, Thomas said firmly. The fever wasn't anyone's fault. Ellie stared into the fire, her young face solemn beyond her years. But he wrote your name on the sign. Why would he do that? Thomas sighed, realizing she'd seen the hidden message. Nothing escaped those observant green eyes. Your father and I, we had a disagreement during the war about something that happened to your Uncle James. Pa's brother, the one who died. Thomas nodded, the familiar weight of guilt settling in his chest. I was his commanding officer. I had to make a choice that put many men in danger, including your uncle. He didn't survive. Ellie considered this, her brow furrowed in concentration. So Pa left me for you to find, because he blames you for Uncle James dying. I think so, Thomas admitted. Adults sometimes do terrible things when they're hurt and angry. To his surprise, Ellie moved closer and put her small hand on his arm. Uncle James wouldn't have wanted that, she said with conviction. Ma said he was the kindest of all the Millers. Her touch and her words struck Thomas to his core. This child, who had every reason to fear and hate adults after what she'd endured, was offering him comfort. The simple wisdom and compassion in her gesture made his throat tighten with emotion. "Thank you, Ellie," he managed to say. "I think your mother was right about that." As the night deepened, Ellie eventually curled up on Thomas's bedroll and fell into an exhausted sleep. Thomas remained by the fire, keeping watch. The storm had passed, leaving behind a sky washed clean of clouds. Stars emerged, brilliant points of light against the darkness. Thomas found himself studying Ellie's sleeping face in the dying firelight. The resemblance to James Miller was unmistakable, now that he knew to look for it: the same determined chin, the same curve to the eyebrows. James had been a good man, steady and reliable. He'd followed Thomas's orders without question, even that final terrible day. The memory surfaced with painful clarity: rain pouring down, the Confederate forces advancing on a town where hundreds of Union supporters had taken refuge. The only way to stop the advance was to destroy the dam upstream, flooding the valley between. But there were Union soldiers in that valley too, James Miller among them. Thomas had given the order, knowing what it meant. Most of the men had made it to higher ground in time. James hadn't. Thomas had found him afterward, broken by the floodwaters, but still alive just long enough to speak a few final words. "Take care of them," James had gasped, gripping Thomas's sleeve with fading strength. "Promise me." Thomas had promised, though he hadn't known who them were. He'd assumed James meant the remaining men in his unit. It was only later, when he'd gone through James's personal effects, that he'd found letters from a brother and sister-in-law in Tucson, Arizona territory. And now, by some twisted working of fate, James Miller's niece had been left in his path. Was this the fulfillment of that promise made to a dying man? Or was it William Miller's revenge, forcing Thomas to confront the human cost of his wartime decision? Either way, Thomas knew he couldn't simply deliver Ellie to the authorities in Silver Creek and continue on his way. He owed James more than that. He owed this child more than that. Dawn broke with the clear, pristine light that followed desert storms. Thomas had dozed intermittently through the night, always keeping one eye open. Years of war and wilderness had taught him to sleep lightly. Ellie woke with the first rays of sun, sitting up and rubbing her eyes with small fists. For a moment, confusion clouded her face, then recognition dawned, followed by the shadow of remembered sorrow. "Good morning," Thomas said, already busy preparing a simple breakfast of coffee for himself and the last of his jerky divided between them. "How are you feeling?" "Better, sir," Ellie replied politely, accepting her portion with careful hands. "Thank you for finding me." The simple gratitude in her words made Thomas's chest ache. This child had been abandoned by her own father, left to die in the desert, yet she maintained a dignity and courtesy that many adults lacked. "We should reach Silver Creek by midday," Thomas said as they ate. "There's a doctor there who can make sure you're all right." Ellie nodded, but her eyes showed uncertainty. "What happens to me after that?" It was the question Thomas had been wrestling with all night. "First things first," he said gently. "Let's get you somewhere safe and comfortable. Then we'll figure out what comes next." They broke camp efficiently, Thomas showing Ellie how to roll up the bedding and secure it to Whiskey's saddle. The girl was a quick learner, eager to help rather than be a burden. By the time the sun had fully cleared the horizon, they were riding again. Ellie seated in front of Thomas as before. The desert had been transformed by the night's rain. Tiny wildflowers had appeared as if by magic, dotting the normally barren landscape with splashes of yellow, purple, and white. The air smelled fresh and clean, and even Whiskey seemed to move with renewed energy. "Look," Ellie said, pointing to a cluster of small yellow blossoms beside the trail. "Desert marigolds. Ma loved those. She said they are tougher than they look." "Like someone else, I know," Thomas replied, earning a small, shy smile from the girl. As they rode, Thomas found himself telling Ellie about his work as a postal rider, explaining how he carried mail between scattered settlements across the territory. She listened with interest, asking intelligent questions about the different towns and the people who lived there. "Have you always been a mail carrier?" she asked eventually. "No," Thomas admitted. "Before the war, I worked my family's farm in Tennessee. Well, there wasn't much left to go back to." "Because of the fighting," Thomas nodded. "And other things. Sometimes life takes unexpected turns." Ellie considered this with a seriousness beyond her years. "Like now," she said finally. "This is an unexpected turn." "Yes," Thomas agreed, surprised by her insight. It certainly is. The sun climbed higher, beating down with increasing intensity as the moisture from the previous night's rain evaporated. Thomas kept a careful eye on Ellie, making sure she drank water regularly. Despite her improvement, she was still weak from her ordeal. Around mid-morning, they crested a rise and saw Silver Creek in the distance. The town was small but well-established, nestled in a valley where a spring-fed creek provided year-round water, a rarity and treasure in this arid land. From their vantage point, Thomas could make out a cluster of wooden buildings, a church steeple, and scattered homesteads surrounding the central settlement. "Is that it?" Ellie asked, shading her eyes with one hand. "That's Silver Creek," Thomas confirmed. "Population about 300 last I heard. They have a school, a doctor, and the best apple pie in the territory at the Silver Spur Cafe." This earned him another small smile. "I like apple pie," Ellie said softly as if admitting the secret. As they descended toward the town, Thomas noticed Ellie growing tense. Her small shoulders hunched, and she seemed to draw in on herself. It wasn't hard to guess why, after her father's betrayal, the child had good reason to be wary of strangers. "The people in Silver Creek are good folks," Thomas assured her. "I've been delivering mail here for nearly 3 years. They'll help us." Ellie nodded but didn't relax. "Will I have to tell them about Pa and what he did?" Thomas sighed, wishing he could shield her from that necessity. "The sheriff will need to know, but you don't have to talk about it with everyone. And I'll be right there with you." She seemed reassured by this promise, leaning back against him as they approached the town's main street. Thomas was acutely aware of the picture they presented, a weathered, solitary man with a half-starved child in tattered clothes. They were bound to attract attention, and not all of it welcome. Silver Creek's main street was a wide dirt road lined with false-fronted wooden buildings. A few horses stood hitched outside the general store, and two women in calico dresses paused in their conversation to stare as Thomas and Ellie rode past. Thomas nodded politely but kept whiskey moving at a steady pace toward the doctor's office at the far end of town. They had just passed the Silver Spur Cafe when a door opened, and a woman stepped out, nearly colliding with them. Thomas reined in sharply, and Whiskey snorted in protest. "I beg your pardon," the woman said, looking up. Her voice was melodious with a slight accent Thomas couldn't place. When she saw Ellie, her expression changed from polite apology to concern. "Oh my goodness, is the child all right?" The woman was in her mid-30s with warm brown eyes and chestnut hair pulled back in a neat bun. She wore a simple blue dress, practical but well-made, and carried several books tucked under one arm. "We're headed to the doctor," Thomas explained. "Found her out in the desert yesterday. She's been through a rough time." The woman's face softened with a compassion. "I'm Clara Montgomery, the school teacher here." She addressed Ellie directly, her voice gentle. "What's your name, dear?" Ellie hesitated, looking up at Thomas for reassurance. When he nodded, she answered quietly, "Eleanor Miller, ma'am, but most people call me Ellie." Something flickered in Clara Montgomery's eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or surprise, but it was gone so quickly Thomas thought he might have imagined it. "Well, Ellie," Clara said warmly, "I'm very glad Mr. Blackwood," Thomas supplied. "Thomas Blackwood. Mr. Blackwood found you. Dr. Harrison's office is just down the street, the white building with the blue door. But I wondered—" She paused, seeming to make a decision. "The doctor often makes house calls in the morning. He might not be back yet. My house is closer, just behind the schoolhouse. I could give Ellie something to eat and help her clean up while someone fetches the doctor." Thomas hesitated. His instinct was to keep moving, to deliver Ellie to the proper authorities and continue on his route. Getting involved any further would only complicate matters. Yet there was something in Clara Montgomery's manner that inspired trust and openness and honesty that was rare in these parts. Before he could decide, Ellie spoke up. "Could we, Mr. Blackwood? I'm awful hungry and—" She glanced down at her torn, filthy dress, a flush of embarrassment coloring her pale cheeks. Thomas's resistance crumbled. How could he deny this child such a simple comfort after all she'd endured? "Thank you, Miss Montgomery. That's very kind." Clara smiled, a warm, genuine expression that transformed her serious face. "It's no trouble at all. The school is just this way." She led them past the general store to a modest white building with a bell tower. Behind it stood a small cottage surrounded by a picket fence. Unlike most yards in the arid town, this one boasted a thriving garden of vegetables and flowers carefully tended and well watered. You have a garden, Ellie said, her voice brightening. Just like Ma used to. I find it soothes the soul, Clara replied, opening the gate. There's nothing quite like watching things grow. Thomas helped Ellie down from whiskey, then dismounted himself. He tied the mare to a hitching post near a water trough, where the horse immediately began to drink. Clara's cottage was small but immaculate, with simple furniture and walls lined with bookshelves. The front room served as both parlor and kitchen, with a cast-iron stove in one corner and a round table in the center. Two doors led off to what Thomas presumed were a bedroom and possibly a washroom. Please sit, Clara invited, gesturing to the table. I'll put on some tea and heat up some stew. It's left over from yesterday, but still good. While Clara busied herself at the stove, Thomas helped Ellie into a chair. The girl looked around with wide eyes, taking in the books that filled every available space. Some were stacked on the table, others lined up neatly on shelves, and still more piled on the floor beside an armchair near the window. You have so many books, Ellie breathed, clearly impressed. Clara glanced over her shoulder with a smile. Books are my one extravagance. Each one is a different world waiting to be explored. As Clara set bowls of steaming stew before them, Thomas noticed Ellie's hands were trembling slightly. The child was putting on a brave face, but her ordeal had taken a greater toll than she was letting on. After you've eaten, Clara said to Ellie, I have a wash tub you can use to get cleaned up, and I think I might have a dress that could be altered to fit you. It belonged to my... She stopped abruptly, a shadow crossing her face. It's been packed away for some time, but it should do until we can get you something proper. Thomas wondered at her hesitation but didn't press. Everyone in these frontier towns had stories they preferred not to tell, histories left behind with the civilization they'd fled. As they ate, Thomas explained how he had found Ellie tied to the post in the desert. He omitted the crueler details, the sign's message, and William Miller's deliberate targeting of him, but made it clear that the child had been abandoned by her father after her mother's death. Clara listened with growing horror, her hand occasionally rising to her throat in distress. How could anyone do such a thing to their own child? She murmured, her eyes never leaving Ellie's face. Grief makes people do terrible things sometimes, Thomas said, repeating what he'd told Ellie the night before. But that doesn't make those things right. After they'd finished eating, Clara showed Ellie to a small room off the kitchen where a metal tub stood ready. She pumped water into a large kettle and set it to heat on the stove, then found a clean dress soap and towels. I'll help her get cleaned up, Clara told Thomas. Perhaps you could let Sheriff Palmer know what's happened. His office is across from the general store, and if you see Dr. Harrison on your way, would you send him here? Thomas nodded, relieved to have a task that would take him away from the cottage for a while. The domesticity of the scene, a woman and child in a cozy home, stirred uncomfortable memories of what he'd lost, what he'd chosen to leave behind. I'll be back soon, he promised Ellie, who watched him with anxious eyes. Miss Montgomery will take good care of you. Outside, Thomas paused to check on Whiskey, who seemed content with the water and shade. The main street was busier now, with people going about their daily business. A wagon loaded with lumber creaked past, followed by a group of children running toward the schoolhouse late for their lessons. Thomas made his way to the sheriff's office, a square building with a small jail attached to the back. Inside, he found Sheriff Palmer, a stocky man with graying temples and the watchful eyes of someone who had seen his share of trouble. Blackwood, the sheriff greeted him with a nod. Thought you weren't due through until tomorrow. Had a change of plans, Thomas replied, removing his hat. He explained his discovery of Ellie and the circumstances as he understood them, again omitting the personal connection to William Miller. Sheriff Palmer listened gravely, making notes in a ledger. Poor little mite, he said when Thomas finished. We'll need to send telegrams, see if there's any family willing to take her in. In the meantime, she can stay at the boarding house. Mrs. Jenkins takes in strays of all sorts. Thomas felt a surprising surge of protectiveness. She's with Miss Montgomery for now. Seems comfortable there. The sheriff raised an eyebrow. Clara's a fine woman, but she keeps to herself, surprised she'd taken a stranger, even a child. She offered, Thomas said simply, I should get back, see if the doctor's been by yet. As he turned to leave, the sheriff called after him. Blackwood, you planning to continue your route tomorrow? The question caught Thomas off guard. His logical mind said yes, he had mail to deliver, a schedule to keep. But something deeper, something he'd thought long buried, whispered otherwise. Not sure yet, he admitted. Depends on what happens with the girl. Sheriff Palmer studied him for a moment, then nodded as if confirming something to himself. Reckon it does at that. Outside, Thomas paused on the boardwalk, momentarily disoriented by the bright sunlight and the weight of the decision before him. His life had followed a careful pattern for 3 years now, riding his route, delivering the mail, keeping human connections brief and superficial. It was safer that way for everyone involved. Yet in the space of a day, that pattern had been shattered by the discovery of one small girl with James Miller's eyes. A girl whose father had deliberately placed her in Thomas's path as an act of vengeance, but who might also represent Thomas's last chance to fulfill a promise made to a dying man. As he stood there wrestling with these thoughts, a flicker of movement across the street caught his attention. A man in a dark coat was watching him from the shadows beside the livery stable. When their eyes met, the stranger turned away quickly, disappearing around the corner of the building. Thomas's hand moved instinctively to his revolver. In his experience, men who watch from shadows rarely had good intentions. He crossed the street following the stranger's path, but when he rounded the corner, there was no sign of the man. The encounter left Thomas uneasy. Silver Creek was a small town where strangers were noticed and remembered. Had William Miller sent someone to ensure his revenge played out as planned? Or was Thomas's wartime paranoia resurfacing, seeing threats where none existed? Either way, it reinforced his reluctance to leave Ellie until he was certain she was safe. With that thought firmly in mind, Thomas headed back toward Clara Montgomery's cottage, his pace quickening with each step. When he arrived, he found Clara sitting on the front porch steps, her face troubled. She stood as he approached, brushing dust from her skirt. "How is she?" Thomas asked, climbing the steps. "Asleep," Clara replied quietly. "The doctor came while you were gone. He says she's suffering from exhaustion and mild dehydration, but with rest and proper care, she should recover fully." She hesitated, then added, "Physically at least." Thomas understood her unspoken concern. Wounds of the spirit took far longer to heal than those of the body. "Did she tell you anything more about what happened?" Clara nodded, wrapping her arms around herself as if suddenly cold despite the warm day. She said her father had been drinking heavily since her mother died of fever last winter, that he'd been talking strangely for weeks, saying someone named Blackwood owed him a debt that had to be paid. Thomas winced. So Ellie knew more than she'd let on. She also said, Clara continued, her eyes searching his face, that her father told her you were responsible for her uncle's death during the war, that you gave an order that killed him even though you could have chosen differently. The accusation hung in the air between them. Thomas felt a familiar weight settle in his chest, the burden of command, of choices made in desperate moments that haunted every quiet hour afterward. "It wasn't that simple," he said finally. "It never is in war." Clara studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "No," she agreed softly. "I don't suppose it ever is." They stood in silence, the weight of unspoken histories pressing down upon them. In the distance, the school bell rang, marking the end of the day's lessons. "Will you tell me what happened?" Clara asked. "With Ellie's uncle?" Thomas looked away, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains. He rarely spoke of the war, had spent years burying those memories under miles of desert trail and the simple rhythm of his postal route. Yet something about Clara Montgomery, her directness perhaps, or the compassion in her eyes, made him consider breaking that silence. It was near the end, he began, the words coming slowly at first. "April of '65. We were part of a Union force trying to hold a strategic valley in Tennessee. Confederate troops were advancing, and we knew they meant to take a town where hundreds of Union sympathizers had taken refuge." He paused, the memories flooding back with painful clarity. "The only way to stop them was to destroy a dam upstream, flooding the valley between. But we had men in that valley too, a reconnaissance unit that included James Miller, Ellie's uncle." Thomas's voice grew rough with remembered pain. "I gave the order to blow the dam. Most of our men made it to higher ground in time. James didn't." Clara's hand went to her throat. "You sacrificed some of your own men to save the townspeople." 19 men. Thomas confirmed the number seared into his memory, against hundreds of civilians. The mathematics of war. It was the right decision strategically, but the right strategic decision can still be personally devastating. Clara finished for him, her voice gentle with understanding. Thomas looked at her in surprise. Most people didn't grasp that distinction, the terrible calculus that commanders had to make in the heat of battle. Yes, he said simply, it was the right choice and I'd make it again. But that doesn't make it any easier to live with. Clara nodded slowly. And now William Miller has abandoned his daughter in your path as some form of revenge, making you responsible for another Miller. So it seems. What will you do? Clara asked, her eyes searching his face. Will you continue your route once Ellie is settled? Thomas hesitated. The logical answer was yes. The mail had to go through, and he had a reputation for reliability that had earned him this prime route. Yet the thought of riding away, of leaving Ellie to whatever fate awaited an orphan child in this harsh territory, sat like a stone in his chest. I don't know, he admitted. I made a promise to James as he was dying. He asked me to take care of them. I always thought he meant the remaining men in his unit, but now I wonder. If he meant his family, Clara finished, his brother and his brother's family. Yes. The school bell rang again, a final call for any stragglers. Clara glanced toward the schoolhouse, then back at Thomas. You should know, she said quietly, that I recognized Ellie's name immediately. The Millers lived in Tucson when I first came to the territory. I was hired as a tutor for their household before I took the teaching position here in Silver Creek. This revelation surprised Thomas. You knew Ellie's family? Clara nodded, a shadow crossing her face. I knew them well. William was different then. Before the war, before his brother's death, he was kind, devoted to his wife. Margaret was delicate but determined. She created beauty wherever she went. Ellie said her mother could make anything grow, even in the desert. A soft smile touched Clara's lips. That she could. Margaret had a way with plants and with people too. She saw the best in everyone. The smile faded. I've often wondered what happened after I left. To hear that William abandoned his own child. Clara trailed off, her expression troubled. There was more to this story. Thomas sensed more than she was saying. Before he could press further, the front door opened, and Ellie appeared, rubbing sleep from her eyes. She had been transformed by rest and care. Her hair, now clean and neatly braided, framed a face that, while still thin, had lost some of its haunted quality. She wore a simple blue dress that hung slightly loose on her small frame, but was a vast improvement for her tattered clothing. Mr. Blackwood, she said, her voice stronger than before. You came back. Thomas felt something twist in his chest at the simple statement and the doubt behind it. Of course the child would expect abandonment. It was all she had known recently. I said I would, he replied gently. Ellie nodded, accepting this with the solemn gravity that seemed to be her nature. She looked from Thomas to Clara, sensing the serious conversation she had interrupted. Are you talking about what happens to me now? She asked directly. Clara exchanged a glance with Thomas, then nodded. Yes, Ellie, we need to figure out what's best for you. The girl's chin lifted slightly, a gesture of determination that reminded Thomas painfully of James Miller. I can work, she offered. I know how to cook simple things and mend clothes. Ma taught me. I won't be a burden. The matter-of-fact way she said it, as if her worth was measured only in her usefulness, made Thomas's heart ache. No child should have to bargain for care and protection. Ellie, he said, kneeling to be at her eye level, you don't have to earn a place to stay. You're a child. It's the job of adults to take care of you, not the other way around. Confusion flickered across her small face. But Pa said, your father was wrong, Clara interrupted gently but firmly, about many things. Ellie considered this, her green eyes thoughtful. Are there other children here in Silver Creek? Clara smiled. Quite a few. I have 23 students in my school from 6 years old to 16. I've never been to a real school, Ellie admitted. Ma taught me at home. She taught you well, Clara assured her. I can tell you're a bright girl. You'd be welcome in my classroom for as long as you're in Silver Creek. The implication that Ellie's stay might be temporary hung in the air between them. Thomas knew the standard procedure for orphan children in the territory. A notice would be posted. Relatives sought, and if none came forward, the child would be placed with whatever family was willing to take them in. If no local family volunteered, she would be sent to the territorial orphanage in Prescott. As if reading his thoughts, Clara added, for now you'll stay here with me. I have a spare room that's hardly used. Relief flooded Ellie's face. Thank you, Miss Montgomery. The girl turned to Thomas, her expression suddenly anxious. Will you stay too, in Silver Creek, I mean? At least for a little while, Thomas found himself caught in that earnest gaze, unable to give the practical answer his logical mind suggested. I have some mail to deliver, he said carefully, but I'll come back, I promise. It was a promise made rashly perhaps, but Thomas found he meant it. Whatever complications might arise, whatever consequences might follow, he couldn't simply walk away from this child who had been placed in his path, whether by revenge or by providence. As the afternoon sun slanted through the cottonwood trees surrounding Clara's cottage, casting dappled shadows across the porch, Thomas felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the tentative stirring of connection of responsibility towards something beyond his next delivery route. It was uncomfortable, this feeling, dangerous even. Connection meant vulnerability, and vulnerability meant pain. He had learned that lesson well during the war, had reinforced it with every mile of lonely trail since. Yet as he watched Ellie's face brighten with the simple promise of his return, Thomas couldn't bring himself to regret the words. Some promises once made had to be kept, even if they led down trails as uncertain and potentially treacherous as the one that now stretched before him. Across the street, unnoticed by any of them, a figure in a dark coat watched from the shadows of the livery stable. The man's face was hard, his eyes cold with calculation as they tracked the trio on Clara Montgomery's porch. Vincent Holloway had waited a long time for Thomas Blackwood to surface. The former Union captain had disappeared after the war, vanishing into the vastness of the Western Territories. But Vincent was a patient man. He had made a promise of his own, standing over the graves of his comrades in that flooded Tennessee valley. Now, with Blackwood finally in his sights, and a child as leverage, Vincent would ensure that justice was served. An eye for an eye, a life for a life. The debt would finally be paid. He melted back into the shadows, already planning his next move. Thomas Blackwood's reckoning was coming, and neither the school teacher nor the Miller girl would be able to save him when it did. The Silver Creek schoolhouse bell rang out across the dusty town, its clear tone marking the start of another day. Clara Montgomery stood at her desk, watching as children filed into the classroom, their voices a mixture of excitement and early morning grogginess. Her gaze drifted repeatedly to the door, searching for one particular student. 3 days had passed since Thomas Blackwood had ridden out of Silver Creek, promising to return after completing his mail route. 3 days since Ellie Miller had come to stay in Clara's spare room, transforming the quiet, orderly cottage with her solemn presence. The door opened one final time, and Ellie slipped in, her thin shoulders squared with determination. The blue dress Clara had altered for her hung a bit loose but was neat and clean. Her brown hair was braided carefully, just as Clara had shown her. Several children turned to stare at the newcomer, whispers rippling through the room. "Good morning, class," Clara said, bringing their attention forward. "Today, we welcome a new student. This is Eleanor Miller, who will be joining us. I expect each of you to make her feel at home." Ellie stood beside Clara's desk, her green eyes taking in the room with cautious assessment, and Clara had learned that this was the child's way, observing carefully before committing herself, a survival skill born of hard experience. "You may take the empty seat next to Sarah," Clara directed, gently indicating a freckled girl near the window. As Ellie made her way to the desk, Clara noted how the other children watched with undisguised curiosity. News traveled quickly in Silver Creek. Everyone knew that Ellie had been found abandoned in the desert, though the crueler details had been kept private. The morning proceeded with reading lessons for the younger children, while the older ones worked on their arithmetic. Clara moved between the groups, but her attention kept returning to Ellie, who bent over her slate with intense concentration, her small face serious. When Clara checked her work, she was startled by what she found. Ellie had not only completed the simple addition problems assigned to new students, but had moved on to the multiplication exercises meant for children several years older. "Ellie," Clara said quietly, "who taught you mathematics?" "Ma did," Ellie replied, her voice soft but steady. "She said numbers make sense when nothing else does. They always follow the same rules." Clara felt a pang of recognition. Margaret Miller had said something similar once during those afternoons when Clara had come to tutor at the Miller home in Tucson. Margaret had been a woman of surprising education for a frontier wife with a particular affinity for mathematics and natural sciences. "Your mother was right," Clara said. "Would you like more challenging problems?" Ellie nodded, a flicker of enthusiasm breaking through her careful reserve. Clara provided her with the work assigned to her oldest student's problems involving fractions and basic algebra. By lunchtime, Ellie had completed these as well, each answer meticulously correct. As the children spilled outside to eat their midday meals in the schoolyard, Clara kept Ellie behind for a moment. "You have a remarkable gift for mathematics," she told the girl. "Your mother must have been an excellent teacher." Ellie's face brightened at the mention of her mother. "Ma said I had a natural talent. Pa didn't see the point, though. He said girls didn't need such learning." Clara felt a familiar frustration rise within her. How many bright young minds had she seen dimmed by such attitudes? "Your father was wrong about that too," she said firmly. "A keen mind is a blessing to be nurtured, regardless of whether one is male or female." Ellie studied Clara with those disconcertingly perceptive green eyes. "You knew my parents, didn't you, before? Mr. Blackwood said you were our tutor once." Clara hesitated. She had hoped to approach this subject more carefully when Ellie was better settled. "Yes, I knew your family in Tucson before the war. I was hired to provide additional education, particularly in literature and languages." "I don't remember you," Ellie said, her brow furrowing, "but I was very young then." "Just a toddler," Clara confirmed. "Not quite 3 when I left." "Why did you leave?" The directness of a child cutting straight to the heart of matters adults preferred to circle. Clara's hand went unconsciously to the locket she wore beneath her high-necked dress. "Sometimes adults make choices based on complicated feelings. Your mother was kind to me, but there were circumstances that made it best for me to seek employment elsewhere." It was a carefully edited truth. Clara couldn't bring herself to tell this child the full story, how William Miller had pursued her, despite his marriage vows, how she had fled rather than become the cause of a family's destruction, how she had carried her own guilt all these years, wondering if her departure had somehow contributed to the man's eventual decline. Ellie seemed to sense there was more to the story, but to Clara's relief, she didn't press further. Instead, she asked, "Do you think Mr. Blackwood will come back soon?" "He promised." The question revealed the fear that Clara knew must haunt the child, fear of another abandonment. "Mr. Blackwood strikes me as a man who keeps his promises," she answered truthfully. "His postal route typically takes 3 to 4 days. I expect we'll see him by tomorrow." Ellie nodded, visibly reassured. "I like it here," she admitted softly. "Your house, the school. It feels safe." The simple statement, delivered with such earnest gratitude, tugged at Clara's heart. "I'm glad," she said, touching Ellie's shoulder gently. "Now go join the others for lunch. Sarah seems eager to make your acquaintance." Through the window, Clara could see the freckled girl hovering near the schoolhouse steps, clearly waiting for Ellie. As the two children walked together toward a shady spot beneath a cottonwood tree, Clara felt a curious mixture of emotions: joy at seeing Ellie begin to integrate into normal childhood, and a deeper, more complex feeling she wasn't quite ready to examine. The afternoon lessons passed quickly, and soon the final bell was ringing. As the children gathered their belongings, the schoolhouse door opened, and Sheriff Palmer appeared, his expression somber. "Miss Montgomery, might I have a word?" he asked, removing his hat. Clara nodded, instructing the children to proceed home in an orderly fashion. Ellie lingered, sensing the serious nature of the sheriff's visit. "You too, Ellie," Clara directed gently. "I'll be home shortly. You can start on those books we discussed." Reluctantly, Ellie left, casting curious glances over her shoulder as she went. When the room had emptied, Sheriff Palmer closed the door and approached Clara's desk. "Got a reply to my telegram about the Miller girl," he said without preamble. Clara's heart quickened. "From family, of a sort." The sheriff extracted a folded paper from his vest pocket. "It's from Ezra Miller, the child's grandfather in Boston. Says he's offering a $500 reward for information leading to her safe return to his custody." Clara frowned. "Ezra Miller, William never spoke of his father during my time with the family." "Seems there was bad blood there," Palmer confirmed. "According to my sources, Ezra Miller disowned his son when he married Margaret Jensen. Didn't approve of the match. She was the daughter of Danish immigrants, educated but without social standing." This aligned with the little Margaret had shared during their brief friendship. She had mentioned a wealthy father-in-law who had cut off all contact, but never in detail. "And now he wants Ellie?" Clara asked, troubled by the timing. "After all these years of silence?" Palmer shrugged. "Money talks. Could be genuine concern for his granddaughter. Could be something else." He studied Clara's face. "Thought you should know, given your connection to the family." "Thank you, Sheriff." Clara folded the telegram carefully. "Has anyone else seen this?" "Not yet. Figured I'd bring it to you first, seeing as you're caring for the girl. He hesitated. There's something else. The telegram didn't come direct from Boston. It was relayed through Tucson, sent by a man named Vincent Holloway, claiming to represent Ezra Miller's interests. Clara didn't recognize the name, but something in the sheriff's tone raised her guard. You know this Holloway? Know of him, Palmer corrected. Former Union sergeant turned bounty hunter after the war. Has a reputation for bringing in his quarry by any means necessary. Not always alive. A chill ran through Clara. You think Ellie is in danger? Hard to say. Palmer retrieved his hat, turning it in his hands thoughtfully. But I find it mighty convenient that this telegram arrives just days after Blackwood brings the girl to town, almost as if someone was watching, waiting for her to be found. The implication was clear. William Miller's abandonment of his daughter might have been part of a larger plan, one that was still unfolding. I should warn Thomas, Clara said, rising from her desk. If you can find him, Palmer agreed. He's due back from his route tomorrow, but in the meantime, keep a close eye on the girl. I'll have my deputy make extra rounds past your place. After the sheriff left, Clara stood motionless, the telegram clutched in her hand. The peaceful routine she had established over the past 3 years in Silver Creek suddenly felt fragile, threatened by shadows from a past she had tried to leave behind. With a deep breath, she gathered her books and papers. Whatever was coming, her first duty was to Ellie. The child had already endured more than any 8-year-old should. Clara would not allow her to face further harm. As she walked home, Clara's mind turned to Thomas Blackwood. There was more to his connection with the Millers than he had revealed, she was certain. The deliberate placement of Ellie in his path spoke of a personal vendetta, one that might well extend beyond William Miller's grievance over his brother's death. Clara quickened her pace, anxiety building with each step. The sooner Thomas returned, the sooner they could unravel this web of connections and ensure Ellie's safety. Ahead, she could see her cottage, its windows glowing with late afternoon light. Smoke rose from the chimney. Ellie must have lit the stove as Clara had shown her. Such a responsible child, so eager to prove her worth. As Clara approached, her front gate movement across the street caught her attention. A man in a dark coat stood in the shadow of the general store watching her house. When he noticed Clara's gaze, he touched the brim of his hat in a gesture that managed to be both polite and menacing before turning away. Clara hurried through her gate, her heart pounding. She had glimpsed only the man's profile, but something about his stance and the calculating coldness of his demeanor set alarm bells ringing in her mind. Inside, she found Ellie seated at the kitchen table reading one of Clara's books on natural history. The girl looked up with a smile that faded when she saw Clara's expression. What's wrong? Ellie asked instantly, alert to danger in the way of children who have learned such vigilance through hard experience. Clara forced herself to calm. No need to frighten the child unnecessarily. Nothing serious, she said, setting down her books. Just a long day. Ellie's perceptive gaze suggested she wasn't convinced, but she didn't press. Instead, she held up the book. This says there are animals that lived long ago that don't exist anymore. Is that true? Grateful for the diversion, Clara explained about fossils and extinction as she prepared their evening meal. Ellie listened with rapt attention, asking thoughtful questions that revealed both her intelligence and her limited exposure to formal education. They ate a simple supper of bean soup and cornbread, their conversation drifting from natural history to Ellie's first day at school. The girl's initial reserve had softened somewhat, though she still chose her words with careful precision. Sarah invited me to visit her family's ranch on Saturday, Ellie mentioned as they cleared the dishes. Her father raises horses, and the Hendersons have one of the finest horse breeding operations in the territory, Clara confirmed. Would you like to go? Ellie hesitated. I'm not sure. What if Mr. Blackwood comes back and I'm not here? The child's loyalty touched Clara. I'm certain he would understand you making friends and enjoying normal activities. Besides, he'll likely return tomorrow, well before Saturday. Ellie considered this, then nodded slowly. All right, if Mr. Blackwood doesn't mind. As Clara helped Ellie prepare for bed, she found herself watching the windows, aware of every sound from outside. The stranger's surveillance had unsettled her more than she cared to admit. She checked that all doors and windows were securely locked before retiring to her own room. Sleep came fitfully interrupted by troubling dreams. In one, she stood in the Miller's garden in Tucson, watching as Margaret lovingly tended her plants. When Margaret turned, her face transformed into Ellie's, then into a skull, grinning with accusation. Clara woke with a gaze, her nightgown damp with sweat despite the cool night air. Dawn found her exhausted but resolved. After seeing Ellie safely to school with instructions to stay within the schoolyard, Clara made her way to the telegraph office. If Ezra Miller was truly searching for his granddaughter, she needed to know his intentions directly, not filtered through this mysterious Vincent Holloway. The telegraph operator, a young man named Jenkins, greeted her with surprise. Clara rarely sent telegrams, her life in Silver Creek being deliberately isolated from her past. "I need to send a message to Boston," she explained, handing over a carefully worded inquiry to Ezra Miller, asking about his intentions regarding Ellie, and requesting he confirm that Vincent Holloway was indeed his representative. "That'll be $2 for 30 words, ma'am," Jenkins informed her. "Might take a day or two for a reply given the distance." Clara paid from her modest teacher's salary, hoping the expense would yield clarity. As she turned to leave, Jenkins called after her. "Almost forgot, Miss Montgomery. This came for you yesterday evening after you'd left school." He handed her a telegram. Clara's heart skipped as she recognized the origin point, Fort Yuma, the last stop on Thomas Blackwood's postal route before returning to Silver Creek. The message was brief but clear. "Delayed by washout, arriving tomorrow. Warn sheriff about Holloway. Blackwood." Clara felt both relief and renewed concern. Thomas was safe but delayed. More troublingly, he knew of Holloway confirming the sheriff's suspicions that something larger was at play. With the telegram tucked securely in her pocket, Clara headed to the sheriff's office. She found Palmer at his desk reviewing wanted posters. "Blackwood sent a telegram," she said without preamble, handing over the message. "He knows about Holloway." Palmer read it twice, his expression grave. "That confirms it. This isn't just about a grandfather claiming his kin." "What do we do?" "Keep the girl close," Palmer advised. "I've got my deputy watching your place. Holloway hasn't made any move yet, but he's still in town. Checked into the hotel 2 days ago claiming to be a cattle buyer." Clara's unease deepened. "Why wait if he's here for Ellie?" "That's what concerns me," Palmer admitted. "I think he's waiting for Blackwood. This feels personal." The sheriff's assessment aligned with Clara's own growing suspicion. Ellie was somehow caught in the middle of a conflict that had nothing to do with her welfare and everything to do with the tangled history between Thomas Blackwood, the Miller family, and this unknown Vincent Holloway. "Be careful, Miss Montgomery," Palmer added as she turned to leave. "Holloway isn't the type to be deterred by a schoolteacher standing in his way." The warning followed Clara like a shadow as she returned to the schoolhouse. Throughout the day's lessons, she found herself glancing at the windows, checking on Ellie, unable to fully focus on her teaching. The other children noticed her distraction, exchanging puzzled looks as she lost her place in readings or repeated instructions. When the final bell rang, Clara kept Ellie behind, explaining that they would walk home together. The child seemed to sense the tension, her own vigilance mirroring Clara's, as they made their way through town. "Is someone following us?" Ellie asked quietly as they passed the general store. Clara squeezed her hand reassuringly. "What makes you ask that?" "You keep looking back," Ellie observed, "and you're walking faster than usual." Perceptive child. "I received a telegram from Mr. Blackwood," Clara said, offering a partial truth. "He's been delayed by a washout on the trail but should arrive tomorrow." Ellie's face brightened at this news, but her relief was short-lived. "But that's not why you're worried." Clara sighed. There was little point in shielding Ellie completely. The child had already endured too much to be fooled by false reassurances. "There's a man in town asking about you," she explained carefully. "He says he represents your grandfather who wants to claim you." Ellie's steps faltered. Grandfather Pa said his father was dead. This revelation surprised Clara. "He told you that?" Ellie nodded. Pa said his father died before I was born, that there was no family left except Uncle James, and he died in the war. Another lie in William Miller's tapestry of deception. But why, what purpose did it serve to cut his daughter off from knowledge of her living grandfather? "Your grandfather is very much alive," Clara said gently. "His name is Ezra Miller, and he lives in Boston. I've sent him a telegram to confirm that he's truly looking for you." Ellie processed this information with the solemn thoughtfulness that Clara had come to recognize as her hallmark. "Does he want me to live with him in Boston?" "I don't know yet," Clara admitted, "but I promise you this, no one will take you anywhere against your will, not while I have any say in the matter." The fierceness in her own voice surprised Clara. When had this child's welfare become so important to her? Was it simply her duty as a teacher, or was it something more, something connected to her history with the Millers, to her own losses? They reached the cottage without incident, but Clara's vigilance didn't wane. She kept Ellie inside for the remainder of the day, finding tasks to occupy the child while maintaining a watchful eye on the windows. As darkness fell, she lit lamps in every room, banishing shadows where threats might lurk. After Ellie had gone to bed, Clara sat at her kitchen table with a cup of tea, Thomas's telegram spread before her. The brief message revealed little, but its urgency was clear. Thomas knew Holloway, and he considered the man dangerous enough to warn them ahead of his own arrival. A soft knock at the front door startled Clara from her thoughts. She froze, listening. It came again, quiet but insistent. Moving silently, Clara took the shotgun she kept for emergencies from its place beside the back door. She had never fired it, but its presence had provided comfort during her years alone in the frontier town. "Who's there?" she called, keeping her voice steady. "It's Palmer," came the reply. "Got news." Relieved, Clara set aside the shotgun and opened the door. The sheriff stood on her porch, his expression tense in the lamplight. "Holloway's gone," he said without preamble. "Checked out of the hotel an hour ago, said he was riding to meet someone. My guess is he's going to intercept Blackwood on the trail." Clara's hand went to her throat. "But why? What does he want with Thomas?" Palmer shook his head. "That's what I aim to find out. I'm riding out at first light to warn Blackwood, try to head off whatever Holloway's planning." He glanced past Clara toward the interior of the cottage. The girl still safely asleep. Clara nodded. "Should I be concerned about her safety with Holloway gone?" "Hard to say. My deputy will keep an eye on your place tonight just in case. But my instinct says Holloway's quarrel is with Blackwood, not the child." After the sheriff left, Clara found herself too anxious for sleep. She brought her quilt to the front room and settled in the rocking chair by the window, determined to maintain her vigil until morning. As she sat watching the quiet street, Clara's mind turned again to the past, to the circumstances that had led her to leave the Miller household in Tucson. The memories were painful, layered with guilt and regret. She had been just 23, newly arrived in the territory from Philadelphia, where her father's gambling debts had destroyed her family's social standing and driven her to seek employment far from the whispers and sidelong glances of former friends. The Millers had seemed the perfect situation, a respectable family with a young child seeking a tutor versed in literature and languages. Margaret Miller had welcomed her warmly, treating her more as a friend than an employee. William had been reserved but courteous, a successful merchant with ambitions of expanding his business. For nearly a year, Clara had been content finding fulfillment in teaching and in Margaret's friendship. Then William's behavior had changed. Lingering glances, contrived moments alone, small gifts left where Margaret wouldn't notice. When Clara rebuffed his advances, his persistence had only increased. Rather than destroy the family she had come to care for, Clara had resigned her position, citing a desire to teach in a formal school setting. Margaret had been puzzled but supportive, helping her secure the position in Silver Creek. William had watched her departure with cold fury, a man unaccustomed to rejection. Clara had often wondered what became of the family after she left. Had William's inappropriate attentions been a momentary lapse or a sign of deeper character flaws that eventually led to his abandonment of Ellie? And what of Margaret, whose gentle strength had made such an impression on Clara? Had she known of her husband's betrayal before her death? The questions circled endlessly, offering no answers, until exhaustion finally claimed Clara in the early hours of the morning. She woke with a start to the sound of birdsong and the realization that dawn had broken without incident. Stiff from her night in the chair, Clara rose to prepare for the day. Ellie appeared from the bedroom, already dressed, her face bright with anticipation. "Mr. Blackwood is coming today," she said, more statement than question. Clara smiled, impressed by the child's resilience. Despite all she had endured, Ellie maintained a capacity for hope that many adults had long since lost. "Yes, though it may be later than expected," Clara confirmed. "The trail was damaged by the recent storms." "Is that why Sheriff Palmer rode out this morning to meet him?" Nothing escaped this child's notice. "Yes, partly," Clara acknowledged. "Now let's have breakfast. We both have a full day ahead." The school day passed with agonizing slowness for Clara, her attention divided between her students and her worry for Thomas. Had Palmer reached him in time? Was Holloway lying in wait somewhere along the trail? And why was this happening at all? When the final bell rang, Clara found herself surrounded by students with questions about homework and upcoming lessons. By the time she had addressed them all, Ellie was nowhere to be seen. Panic flared in Clara's chest. "Has anyone seen Ellie Miller?" she asked the remaining children. Sarah Henderson, the freckled girl who had befriended Ellie, raised her hand. "She said she was going to wait for Mr. Blackwood by the Western Road, ma'am. Said he'd be coming that way." Clara's heart sank. The Western Road passed through a stretch of isolated terrain before reaching Silver Creek, perfect for an ambush. And Ellie, in her innocence, had placed herself directly in harm's way. "Thank you, Sarah," Clara said, struggling to keep her voice calm. "Class dismissed. Go straight home, all of you." As soon as the children had dispersed, Clara gathered her skirts and ran toward the livery stable. She had never been an accomplished rider, but necessity overrode hesitation. Within minutes, she had rented a horse and was galloping toward the Western Road, praying she wasn't too late. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly as Clara urged her mount faster. The road wound through rocky terrain with sparse vegetation offering little shade. Dust billowed behind her, marking her progress like a signal flag. She had ridden perhaps 3 miles when she spotted a small figure seated on a boulder beside the road. Ellie, her blue dress bright against the tan landscape, patiently waiting. Relief flooded Clara, quickly followed by renewed concern. They were exposed here, visible to anyone approaching from either direction. "Ellie," Clara called, reining in her horse. "What are you doing out here alone? It's dangerous." The girl looked up, surprised but unrepentant. "I wanted to be the first to see Mr. Blackwood," she explained, as if this were the most reasonable thing in the world. "I've been watching for dust on the road." Clara dismounted, her legs shaky from the unaccustomed ride. "You shouldn't have left without telling me. I've been worried sick." Ellie's face fell. "I'm sorry, I didn't think. Are you very angry?" The genuine contrition in the child's voice softened Clara's fear-induced frustration. "I'm not angry, just concerned. There are people looking for you who might not have good intentions." "You mean the man who says he works for my grandfather?" Clara nodded, taking Ellie's hand. "Come, we need to get back to town. Mr. Blackwood will find us there when he arrives." As they turned toward Clara's horse, the sound of approaching riders made them both freeze. Clara instinctively pulled Ellie behind her, positioning herself between the child and potential danger. Around the bend in the road came Sheriff Palmer, his horse lathered with sweat from hard riding. Beside him rode Thomas Blackwood, his weathered face tight with concern. Both men reined in sharply at the sight of Clara and Ellie standing by the roadside. "Miss Montgomery," Palmer called, his voice sharp with surprise. "What in blazes are you doing out here?" "Ellie came to wait for Mr. Blackwood," Clara explained, relief making her voice unsteady. "I came to find her." Thomas dismounted in one fluid motion, his eyes going immediately to Ellie. The child broke free from Clara and ran to him, stopping just short of embracing him, her natural reserve reasserting itself at the last moment. "You came back," Ellie said, her voice half statement, half question. Thomas knelt to her level, his expression softening. "I promised I would." Something passed between them in that moment, a recognition perhaps of kindred spirits who had both known abandonment and found it hard to trust again. Sheriff Palmer interrupted the moment, his tone urgent. "We need to get moving. Holloway could be anywhere. He wasn't at the rendezvous point where I expected to find him." Thomas nodded, rising to his feet. "Can you ride double with Miss Montgomery?" he asked Ellie. "My whiskey is too tired to carry extra weight." Ellie nodded, and Thomas lifted her onto Clara's horse before helping Clara mount behind her. As they set off towards Silver Creek, Clara found herself hyper-aware of their vulnerability, 4 figures on the open road silhouetted against the afternoon sky. "Did you encounter Vincent Holloway?" she asked Thomas, keeping her voice low so Ellie wouldn't overhear. Thomas shook his head. "No, but I found signs that someone had been tracking me. Fresh campfire ashes, horse droppings, cigarette butts at several points along my route. Someone was staying just far enough ahead to avoid being seen. But why follow you all that way only to disappear?" "That's what concerns me," Thomas admitted. "Holloway isn't one to give up easily. If he's gone to ground, it's because he's planning something." The name clearly meant something significant to Thomas beyond Sheriff Palmer's general description. "You know him personally," Clara observed. A shadow crossed Thomas's face. "We served in the same regiment, though he was a sergeant under a different captain. After the dam incident that killed James Miller and the others, Holloway was, vocal in his criticism of my decision. He blamed you for the deaths. He led the burial detail, Thomas said quietly. Saw firsthand what the floodwaters did to those men. It changed him. After the war, I heard he'd become a bounty hunter, specializing in tracking down deserters and war criminals. The implication was clear. Thomas Blackwood was now Holloway's quarry, with Ellie somehow figuring into his plan for vengeance. But there were still missing pieces to this puzzle. Why had William Miller abandoned his daughter in Thomas's path? How had Holloway known where to find them? And what role did Ezra Miller, the grandfather Ellie hadn't known existed, play in all this? As they approached the outskirts of Silver Creek, Sheriff Palmer raised his hand, signaling a halt. Something's wrong, he said, his voice tense. Look. Ahead, a plume of dark smoke rose from the center of town, thick and ominous against the late afternoon sky. Fire, Thomas said grimly. Palmer's face hardened. Stay here, I'll ride ahead to assess the situation. But before he could spur his horse forward, the crack of a rifle shot split the air. Palmer jerked, then toppled slowly from his saddle, landing heavily in the dust of the road. Get down, Thomas shouted, leaping from his horse and drawing his revolver in one fluid motion. Clara pulled Ellie from the saddle, both of them tumbling to the ground as another shot kicked up dirt near their feet. Thomas fired back at the unseen assailant, providing cover as Clara dragged Ellie toward a cluster of boulders beside the road. Stay here, Clara ordered, her heart pounding. Don't move unless I call you. Ellie's face was pale with terror, but she nodded, pressing herself against the rough stone. Clara crawled back to where Sheriff Palmer lay motionless, blood spreading across his shirt. Thomas knelt beside her, still scanning the surrounding terrain for the shooter. Is he? Clara couldn't finish the question. Thomas pressed two fingers to Palmer's neck, his expression grim. Still alive, but the bullet hit high in the chest. He needs a doctor immediately. Another shot rang out, splintering the rock near Thomas's head. He returned fire, emptying his revolver toward the ridge where the shooter must be positioned. We're pinned down, he said, reloading quickly. And Palmer doesn't have much time. Clara made a swift decision. Give me your bandana, she instructed, tearing strips from her petticoat. When Thomas handed it over, she fashioned a crude pressure bandage for Palmer's wound. I'll stay with him, she said. You get Ellie to safety. Thomas shook his head. I'm not leaving you here as a target. That fire in town isn't coincidence, Clara argued. This is a diversion. Holloway wants to separate us from Ellie. She met Thomas's eyes steadily. She trusts you. Get her somewhere safe while I tend to Palmer. For a moment, Thomas looked as though he would refuse. Then another shot struck the dirt nearby, and his expression hardened with resolve. There's a line shack about 2 miles east, he said quickly. Used by the Henderson ranch hands during Roundup. Head there once it's clear. I'll find you. Clara nodded, her hands steady despite her fear, as she continued working on Palmer's wound. Thomas crawled back to where Ellie waited, speaking to her in low, urgent tones. The child's eyes widened, but she nodded, her trust in Thomas evident. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, casting long shadows across the rocky terrain, Thomas and Ellie slipped away from the road, using the boulders as cover. Clara watched them go, then turned her attention back to Palmer, whose breathing had grown shallow and labored. Hold on, Sheriff, she murmured, pressing firmly on the bandage. Help will come. But as the shadows lengthened and no more shots came from the ridge, Clara began to wonder if help would arrive in time for any of them. Night fell over the Arizona desert, bringing with it a bone-deep chill that seemed to seep from the very ground. Clara huddled beside Palmer's still form, her hands numb from maintaining pressure on his wound. The bleeding had slowed, but the sheriff's pulse was weak and thready. In the distance, the glow of the fire in Silver Creek had diminished, suggesting it was either under control or had burned itself out. Either way, it had served its purpose, drawing attention away from the ambush on the western road. Clara strained her ears for any sound of approach, friend or foe, but heard only the whisper of wind through scrub brush and the occasional call of a hunting owl. The isolation pressed in around her, a reminder of just how vulnerable they were. Palmer stirred, a low groan escaping his lips. Clara leaned closer. Sheriff, can you hear me? His eyes fluttered open, unfocused at first, then sharpening with awareness. Miss Montgomery, he rasped. What happened? You were shot, Clara explained, keeping her voice low. Mr. Blackwood took Ellie to safety, while I stayed with you. Palmer attempted to sit up, then fell back with a grimace of pain. Holloway. We haven't seen him. There was a sniper on the ridge and a fire in town, a diversion, we think. The sheriff processed this with a professional's assessment. Clever. Separate you divide resources. He coughed, the sound wet and troubling. How bad is it? Clara couldn't bring herself to lie. The bullet is still inside. You've lost a lot of blood. Palmer closed his eyes briefly. Not my first shooting. Won't be what takes me down. His voice was determined, but the pallor of his face told a different story. We need to get you to Dr. Harrison, Clara said, glancing toward the town. Do you think you could ride if I helped you? Before Palmer could answer, the sound of approaching hoofbeats made them both tense. Clara reached for the sheriff's revolver, which lay beside him in the dust. Stay still, she whispered, raising the heavy weapon with both hands. The rider approached slowly, deliberately. In the dim starlight, Clara could make out a silhouette atop a horse, but not the rider's identity. Miss Montgomery, a familiar voice called. Sheriff Palmer. Relief flooded through Clara. Dr. Harrison, over here. The town doctor dismounted quickly, medical bag in hand. He knelt beside Palmer, his experienced fingers finding the wound immediately. Gunshot upper chest, Clara reported. I've been maintaining pressure, but he's lost a significant amount of blood. Harrison nodded, already opening his bag. You did well. Let me take over now. As the doctor worked, Clara asked, how did you know to come? Thomas Blackwood rode into town with the Miller girl, raising the alarm. Said you were out here with Palmer, who'd been shot. Harrison's hands moved with practiced efficiency as he spoke. The fire at the livery stable was mostly contained by then. No serious damage, thankfully. And Ellie, is she safe? Blackwood took her to my office. My wife is with her. Harrison paused in his work, meeting Clara's eyes. He said to tell you he's going after Holloway alone, said it was the only way to end this. Clara's heart sank. Of course, Thomas would feel compelled to confront the threat directly to protect Ellie and perhaps to face his own past. But Vincent Holloway had already demonstrated his ruthlessness. Thomas might be walking into a trap. We need to get Palmer to town, Harrison said, interrupting her thoughts. I've stabilized him for now, but the bullet needs to come out in proper conditions. With the doctor's help, Clara got the sheriff mounted on Harrison's horse. The doctor would lead the animal while Clara followed on foot, a slow journey but their only option. As they started towards Silver Creek, Clara's thoughts remained with Thomas and Ellie. The child had already lost so much. To lose Thomas now, just when she had begun to trust again, would be a cruel blow. And Clara herself. When had Thomas Blackwood become more than just a passing figure in her carefully ordered life? When had his safety begun to matter so deeply to her? The questions echoed in her mind as they made their slow way back to town, where fires smoldered and a hunter of men waited to spring his trap. In Silver Creek, windows glowed with lamplight as residents kept vigil, wary of further trouble. The fire at the livery stable had been extinguished, leaving behind charred timber and the acrid smell of smoke. Men with shotguns patrolled the main street, citizens deputized in the sheriff's absence. Dr. Harrison's office stood at the far end of town, a modest building with a small sign identifying his practice. Inside, his wife Rebecca, a capable woman who served as his nurse and assistant, had prepared the examination room for surgery. Bring him through, she directed as they arrived with the Palmer. Everything's ready. As the doctor and his wife focused on saving the sheriff's life, Clara made her way to the small waiting room. There she found Ellie curled in a chair, wrapped in a blanket, her face pale with exhaustion and worry. Miss Montgomery, the child exclaimed, jumping up and running to embrace Clara. The spontaneous show of affection caught Clara by surprise. Ellie had maintained a careful physical distance until now, a product of her recent trauma. Clara returned the hug, feeling the child's small body trembling against her. I'm here, she soothed. You're safe now. Ellie pulled back, her green eyes serious. But Mr. Blackwood isn't. He went to find the bad man. I know, Clara said gently. Mr. Blackwood is very capable. He'll be careful. But the reassurance rang hollow even to her own ears. Vincent Holloway had orchestrated an elaborate trap using Ellie as bait and creating diversions that separated their small group. He had shot the sheriff without hesitation and set fire to the livery stable, endangering the entire town. Such a man would not be easily outmaneuvered. Where did Thomas go? Clara asked, keeping her voice steady for Ellie's benefit. He didn't say exactly, Ellie replied, but he took extra bullets for his gun and asked Dr. Harrison if anyone in town had seen a man in a dark coat asking questions. Standard preparations for a confrontation. Thomas was hunting Holloway just as Holloway had hunted him. Did he leave any message for me besides what Dr. Harrison conveyed? Ellie nodded, reaching into her pocket to produce a folded piece of paper. He wrote this, said to give it to you if you came back safely. Clara unfolded the note with trembling fingers. Thomas's handwriting was neat and precise, the mark of an educated man, despite his frontier appearance. Clara Holloway won't stop until he has what he came for. I can't risk more innocent lives. There's a connection between him and Ezra Miller that goes beyond Ellie's something from the war that I'm only beginning to understand. If I don't return, there's a letter in my saddlebag explaining everything. Ellie deserves the truth about her family when she's old enough to bear it. Take care of her. She trusts you, and so do I, Thomas. The simplicity of the note belied the weight of its meaning. Thomas was saying goodbye, preparing for the possibility that he wouldn't survive his confrontation with Holloway. And he was entrusting Ellie to Clara's care, a responsibility she hadn't sought, but now found she desperately wanted to fulfill. Is Mr. Blackwood coming back? Ellie asked, watching Clara's face with that disconcerting perception. Clara folded the note carefully, buying time to compose herself. He certainly intends to, she said finally, but he wants us to stay safe here until he does. Ellie considered this, her small face solemn. He promised he wouldn't leave me, she said with simple faith. Mr. Blackwood keeps his promises. The child's trust was both heartbreaking and inspiring. Despite everything she had endured, her mother's death, her father's abandonment, being left to die in the desert, Ellie still maintained the capacity to believe in the goodness of others. Clara could only pray that her faith in Thomas Blackwood would be vindicated. As the night deepened, Clara and Ellie waited in the doctor's front room, listening to the muffled sounds of surgery from behind the closed door. Rebecca Harrison brought them tea and blankets, her kind face drawn with a concern. Any word from Mr. Blackwood? She asked, quietly glancing at Ellie, who had finally succumbed to exhaustion and fallen asleep in her chair. Clara shook her head. Nothing. How is Sheriff Palmer? Edward is removing the bullet now, Rebecca replied. The sheriff is strong, but he's lost a great deal of blood. The next few hours will be critical. After Rebecca returned to assist her husband, Clara moved to the window, parting the curtain to gaze out at the darkened street. Somewhere out there, Thomas was facing a man bent on revenge for wounds inflicted years ago. A man who had already proven his willingness to harm innocent bystanders in pursuit of his quarry. What was the connection between Holloway and Ezra Miller that Thomas had mentioned in his note? How had William Miller factored into this tangled web? And why had Ellie been used as bait in a vendetta she had no part in? The questions circled endlessly, offering no answers. Clara let the curtain fall back into place and returned to her chair beside Ellie. The child slept fitfully, small whimpers, occasionally escaping her lips as she battled nightmares. Gently, Clara stroked Ellie's hair, murmuring soothing words. As she did, a memory surfaced, Margaret Miller doing the same for her daughter during a thunderstorm that had frightened the young child. Clara had witnessed the scene during her time in the Miller household, touched by the tenderness between mother and daughter. Now, years later, Clara found herself in Margaret's place, offering comfort to the child who had lost so much. The realization brought a lump to her throat. Was this how families were formed, not through blood or legal bonds, but through moments of care and connection? The thought led to another, more troubling one. Was she allowing herself to become too attached to Ellie? The child's situation remained unresolved. If Ezra Miller truly wanted his granddaughter, if he could provide a stable home and education, wouldn't that be better for Ellie than remaining with a small-town schoolteacher of limited means? And Thomas, what role did he envision for himself in Ellie's future? His note suggested he saw Clara as the child's primary caretaker. But was that his true wish, or merely a contingency? If he didn't survive his confrontation with Holloway, Clara had spent 3 years in Silver Creek, cultivating independence, keeping emotional entanglements at bay. Now, in the space of a few days, she found herself deeply invested in the welfare of both a child and a man she barely knew. The realization was both exhilarating and terrifying. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows of the doctor's office. A storm was brewing, both literally and figuratively. Clara pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, settled more comfortably in her chair, and prepared for a long night of waiting. In the darkness beyond Silver Creek, Thomas Blackwood tracked his hunter, determined to end the threat to Ellie and to face the ghosts of his past that had followed him to this remote corner of the Arizona territory. Thomas Blackwood moved like a shadow through the desert night, each step deliberate and silent. The moon hung low on the horizon, casting just enough light to navigate by without revealing his position. He had been tracking Vincent Holloway for hours, following signs that most men would miss: a displaced stone-bent sagebrush, the faint impression of a boot heel. War and wilderness had taught Thomas patience. Holloway was clever, but he was also arrogant. He had left Silver Creek believing he held all the advantages, that Thomas would be too concerned with Ellie's safety, too distracted by the wounded sheriff to mount an effective pursuit. What Holloway didn't understand was that Thomas had spent 3 years riding the postal routes of the Arizona territory. He knew every wash, every ridge, every hidden spring within 50 miles of Silver Creek. This was his ground now, not the blood-soaked fields of Tennessee where they had last faced each other. A flicker of movement ahead caught Thomas's attention. He froze, becoming one with the shadows beneath a juniper tree. 50 yards away, a small campfire burned in a sheltered hollow, partially concealed by rock formations. A solitary figure moved around the fire, his silhouette unmistakable. Holloway. Thomas studied the camp carefully. It appeared Holloway was alone, but caution had kept Thomas alive through a war and its aftermath. He circled the perimeter, checking for signs of companions or lookouts. Finding none, he crept closer, his Colt revolver a reassuring weight at his side. The wind shifted, carrying voices from the camp. Thomas stiffened. Holloway was not alone after all. Pressing himself against a boulder, Thomas strained to hear the conversation. "Should have confirmed the kill," an unfamiliar voice was saying, the tone cultured Eastern. "The sheriff may still live." "Palmer's as good as dead," Holloway replied dismissively. "And Blackwood's too busy protecting the girl to come after us tonight. You underestimate him at your peril." The stranger's voice carried an authority that made Thomas's skin prickle. He survived the war when many didn't. He survived 3 years in this godforsaken territory. "He won't survive me," Holloway stated flatly. "Not when I have something he wants." The conversation confirmed Thomas's worst fears. Holloway hadn't been working alone. In whatever game they were playing, Ellie was central to it, a pawn in a vendetta Thomas was only beginning to understand. Moving with increased caution, Thomas positioned himself where he could observe the camp without being seen. The firelight illuminated 2 men: Holloway with his dark coat and hard face, and an older gentleman Thomas had never seen before. The stranger wore clothes too fine for the frontier, a wool suit now wrinkled from travel, and a silk vest with a gold watch chain. "When will your men return from Tucson?" the older man asked. "By noon tomorrow," Holloway answered, "with the papers you requested. Once they arrive, we can proceed with the final stage." "And the girl, she remains secure in Silver Creek?" "Under the school teacher's protection," Holloway confirmed with a hint of mockery. "Playing house while Blackwood plays hero." The older man's expression hardened. "Remember our agreement, Sergeant. The child is not to be harmed. Whatever your quarrel with Blackwood Eleanor remains untouched." Thomas frowned, trying to make sense of what he was hearing. The stranger clearly had authority over Holloway, yet seemed concerned for Ellie's welfare. Could this be Ezra Miller, the grandfather she'd never known existed? If so, why partner with a man like Holloway? "I keep my word, Mr. Miller," Holloway replied, confirming Thomas's suspicion. "The girl will be delivered safely to you once Blackwood is dealt with. You'll have your granddaughter, I'll have my justice, and we can part ways." Ezra Miller stared into the fire, his face troubled. "Justice," he repeated softly. "Is that truly what you seek, or merely revenge?" Holloway's laugh held no humor. "What's the difference when the end result is the same? Blackwood gave the order that killed 19 good men, including your son James. He deserves to pay for that." "James understood the risks of war," Miller replied, his voice heavy with old grief. "He chose to serve, knowing he might not return." "He chose to serve under an officer he trusted," Holloway countered sharply. "An officer who betrayed that trust when he sacrificed those men to save a town of strangers." The accusation hung in the night air, a distorted reflection of the choice that had haunted Thomas for years. He had given the order to destroy the dam, knowing some of his men wouldn't reach high ground in time. It had been the right decision, strategically saving hundreds of civilian lives at the cost of 19 soldiers. But the weight of those deaths had never left him. "War forces impossible choices," Miller said after a long pause. I've had years to consider Captain Blackwood's decision. Would I have preferred my son live? Of course. But would I have condemned hundreds of innocents to death to save him? I cannot say I would. Holloway spat into the fire. Then you're a better man than me, Mr. Miller, because I would have let that whole damn town burn to save my brothers in arms. Miller shook his head sadly. And that, Sergeant, is why men like you should never be given command. The older man's unexpected defense of Thomas's wartime decision was startling. All these years, Thomas had assumed the entire Miller family blamed him for James's death. To hear Ezra Miller express understanding, even a measure of acceptance, challenged everything Thomas had believed about his pursuit. Regardless, Holloway continued undeterred, our arrangement stands. You get your granddaughter, I get Blackwood, whether you approve of my methods or not. Yes, Miller agreed reluctantly, though I find myself increasingly troubled by our partnership. Too late for second thoughts, Holloway said dismissively. You hired me to find Eleanor after William disappeared with her. I've fulfilled my part of the contract. You found her tied to a post in the desert? Miller retorted, anger flaring. Left there by my own son with a cruel sign around her neck. Had Blackwood not discovered her when he did? But he did, Holloway interrupted. And now we can conclude our business, unless you've developed scruples about using the girl as bait. Miller's face hardened. I hired you to find my granddaughter, not to use her in your vendetta. Had I known your true intentions, you'd have what? Found someone else, someone who wouldn't track William Miller across 3 territories, who wouldn't discover that he'd developed a pathological hatred for the man he blamed for his brother's death. Holloway's voice was cold with contempt. Face it, Mr. Miller, you needed me. Still do if you want to take the girl back to Boston without legal complications. The revelation struck Thomas like a physical blow. Holloway had been tracking William Miller, not Thomas himself. He had discovered William's plan to abandon Ellie in Thomas's path and had seen an opportunity to further his own vendetta. 2 separate quests for vengeance converging on one small girl. Miller rose abruptly, pacing beside the fire. I want to see Eleanor tomorrow, before your men return from Tucson. I need to know she's truly well, not just take your word for it. Fine, Holloway agreed with a shrug. We'll ride into Silver Creek at dawn. You can see the girl and I'll flush out Blackwood. 2 birds, 1 stone. Thomas had heard enough. Holloway planned to enter Silver Creek at dawn, putting Ellie, Clara, and the entire town at risk again. He had to warn them, had to prepare a defense against whatever Holloway was planning. As he began to withdraw, a small stone dislodged beneath his boot, clattering down the slope toward the camp. Both men at the fire froze, then Holloway was on his feet in an instant, gun drawn. Someone's out there, he said, his voice low and dangerous. Thomas knew his position was compromised. He could try to retreat silently, but Holloway was already moving toward his hiding place, scanning the darkness with experienced eyes. Making a swift decision, Thomas stepped into the open, his Colt leveled at Holloway's chest. That's far enough, Sergeant. Holloway stopped, a slow smile spreading across his face. Captain Blackwood, I was wondering when you'd show yourself. Ezra Miller rose from beside the fire, his expression a mixture of shock and something Thomas couldn't quite identify, relief perhaps, or resignation. Lower your weapon, Holloway, Thomas ordered, keeping his voice steady. We're going to have a conversation, the 3 of us. About Ellie, about William, about whatever game you're playing. Holloway's smile didn't waver. I don't think so, Captain. You see, you're outnumbered. Before Thomas could react, the cold press of a gun barrel against the back of his head confirmed Holloway's words. He had missed something, a third person hidden away from the camp. Drop the gun, Blackwood, a rough voice commanded from behind him. Thomas hesitated, calculating his options. They were few and poor. I said drop it. The gun pressed harder, emphasizing the command. Slowly, Thomas lowered his Colt, then let it fall to the ground. As he straightened, a brutal blow to the back of his head sent him sprawling forward. The world went dark before he hit the ground. When Thomas regained consciousness, dawn was breaking over the eastern horizon, painting the desert in shades of pink and gold. He was propped against a boulder, his hands bound tightly behind his back. His head throbbed where he'd been struck, and his mouth was dry as dust. Holloway sat across from him, cleaning his revolver with methodical precision. Ezra Miller was nowhere to be seen, nor was the unknown third man who had captured Thomas. Welcome back, Captain, Holloway said without looking up from his task. Thought you might sleep through the main event. Thomas tested his bonds, finding them professionally secure. Where's Miller? Riding to Silver Creek with Davis, Holloway replied, eager to meet his granddaughter after all these years. Touching, really. And you stayed behind to what finished me off quietly away from witnesses. Holloway smiled, the expression never reaching his cold eyes. Eventually. But first, we're going to have that conversation you mentioned, about choices and consequences. He holstered his cleaned revolver and leaned forward, elbows on his knees. You know, I've imagined this moment for years. Pictured what I'd say when I finally caught up to you. Rehearsed it in my mind 1,000 times. And now that the moment's here, Thomas asked, playing for time as he worked at the ropes binding his wrists. Now I find words inadequate, Holloway admitted. How do you quantify the value of 19 lives? How do you measure the weight of betrayal? It wasn't betrayal, Thomas said quietly. It was war, a terrible choice between bad options. You could have waited for reinforcements, could have found another way to stop the Confederate advance. Thomas shook his head. There was no time. The town would have been overrun within hours. Hundreds would have died, including the women and children who had taken refuge there. So you sacrificed my friends instead? Holloway's voice hardened. My brothers, men who trusted you to lead them safely through the war. Men who understood that sometimes safety isn't possible, Thomas countered. Every soldier in that valley knew the risks when they enlisted. Holloway stood abruptly, pacing like a caged predator. Easy for you to say. You gave the order from the safety of the hilltop. You didn't have to pull their bodies from the mud, didn't have to write to their families. The accusation struck home. Thomas had written those letters, 19 of them, each carefully composed, each bearing the terrible weight of his decision. But he hadn't been the one to recover the bodies. That grim task had fallen to Holloway and his burial detail. I'm sorry for what you had to witness, Thomas said sincerely. No man should have to do what you did. Holloway stopped pacing, his expression surprised at the unexpected apology. For a moment, something like understanding passed between them. Two soldiers who had seen too much, who carried the scars of war in different ways. Then Holloway's face hardened again. Sorry doesn't bring them back. Sorry doesn't help James Miller's daughter, abandoned by a brother who couldn't live with his grief. Is that why you're doing this? Thomas asked. For James's sake or for your own? The question seemed to catch Holloway off guard. He stared at Thomas for a long moment, then looked away. Does it matter the result is the same? It matters, Thomas insisted. James Miller was a good man. He wouldn't want his death used to justify more killing. You don't know what he would have wanted, Holloway snapped. You didn't know him like I did. I knew him well enough, Thomas replied steadily. Well enough to be with him at the end, to hear his last words. This was a gamble. Holloway had led the burial detail, but Thomas had been the one to find James Miller after the flood, still clinging to life despite his injuries. Had Holloway known that, or had he assumed James had died instantly in the rushing waters? Holloway's expression confirmed he hadn't known. What last words? He demanded. He was already dead when we found him. No, Thomas said softly. He lived long enough to speak, to extract a promise from me. What promise? Holloway's voice was barely above a whisper, his composure cracking for the first time. He asked me to take care of them, Thomas revealed. His family. I thought he meant his unit, the men who survived. Only later did I learn about his brother in Tucson, his sister-in-law, and their young daughter. Holloway stared at Thomas, clearly shaken by this revelation. You're lying. I have no reason to lie, not now. Thomas met Holloway's gaze steadily. Why do you think I took this postal route? It passes through Tucson. I've been checking on the Miller family from a distance for years, honoring James's last request as best I could. It was the truth, though Thomas had never intervened directly in the Millers' lives. He had observed from afar, noting William's gradual decline after Margaret's death concerned, but uncertain of his right to interfere. Until Ellie had been left in his path, forcing his hand. Holloway sank back onto his seat, the rigid certainty that had driven him for years visibly wavering. If what you say is true, why didn't you stop William from abandoning the girl? I didn't know his plans, Thomas admitted. I knew he was struggling after his wife died, knew he'd been drinking heavily, but I never imagined he would do something so cruel to his own child. A heavy silence fell between them, broken only by the soft morning breeze stirring the desert scrub. Thomas continued working at his bonds, feeling the ropes begin to give slightly. "It doesn't change anything," Holloway said finally, but his voice lacked conviction. "You still gave the order. Those men are still dead." "Yes," Thomas acknowledged, "and I'll carry that responsibility for the rest of my life. But killing me won't bring them back. It won't help Ellie. It will only add another death to the toll of a war that's already taken too many." Holloway stood again, drawing his revolver with deliberate slowness. "Maybe, but it might bring some peace to the living." Thomas tensed, preparing for the shot. But instead of aiming at Thomas, Holloway stared at the weapon in his hand, turning it over as if seeing it for the first time. "7 years," he said softly. "7 years I've hunted you, imagined this moment. And now—" He trailed off, his expression troubled. "And now you're not sure," Thomas finished for him. "Because deep down you know this isn't justice. It's just more death." Before Holloway could respond, the sound of approaching riders made them both turn. 3 men appeared on the ridge above the camp, silhouetted against the morning sky. Thomas recognized the middle figure immediately, Ezra Miller, his posture rigid with tension. The others were strangers, hard-faced men with rifles. "Holloway," Miller called as they descended toward the camp. "We have a problem." The sergeant straightened, holstering his revolver. "What happened?" "The girl is gone," Miller reported grimly as they reached the camp, "along with the school teacher. No one in town knows where they went." Holloway's face darkened with anger. "Gone? How is that possible? Davis was watching the doctor's office all night." One of the strangers, presumably Davis, shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "They must have slipped out the back while I was checking the perimeter. The town was in K's after the fire." Thomas felt a surge of relief, quickly masked. Clara had gotten Ellie to safety. The school teacher was more resourceful than Holloway had given her credit for. "Find them," Holloway ordered sharply. "They can't have gone far, not with the girl slowing them down." "That's not all," Miller interrupted. "The sheriff survived. He's wounded but conscious, and he sent telegrams to the territorial marshal and to Fort Grant requesting assistance." This news clearly unsettled Holloway. "How long until they arrive?" "The marshal could be here by tomorrow, the soldiers perhaps sooner." Holloway cursed under his breath. "Then we need to move quickly. Find the girl, complete our business, and be gone before they arrive." Throughout this exchange, Ezra Miller had been studiously avoiding looking at Thomas. Now finally the older man turned to face the bound prisoner. Their eyes met, and Thomas was struck by the resemblance to James, the same determined set of the jaw, the same clear gaze. "Mr. Blackwood," Miller said formally, "I find myself in the uncomfortable position of both thanking you and condemning you. You saved my granddaughter's life, yet your wartime decision cost me my son." "Your son died a hero," Thomas replied simply. "He would be proud of Ellie. She has his courage, his intelligence." Something flickered in Miller's eyes, pain, perhaps, or regret. "So I'm told. I had hoped to meet her today to begin making amends for years of absence." "Amends?" Thomas questioned. "Or abduction?" Holloway made it clear you intend to take her to Boston regardless of her wishes. Miller bristled. "She's my granddaughter, my blood. William proved himself unfit as a father. The child needs stability, education, advantages this frontier cannot provide." "She needs love," Thomas countered. "Security, people she can trust not to abandon her. She's found that with Clara Montgomery." "A school teacher of limited means in a dusty frontier town." Miller's tone was dismissive. "What future can she offer Eleanor?" Before Thomas could respond, Holloway interrupted impatiently. "This debate is pointless until we find the girl. Davis, take Wilson and search the northern road. I'll check the southern route toward Tucson. Miller, you stay here with Martinez and guard our prisoner." The men quickly mounted, splitting up as ordered. Soon only Miller, Thomas, and a stone-faced Mexican man remained in the camp. Martinez took up position at the perimeter, rifle at the ready, while Miller sank onto a rock across from Thomas. For several minutes, neither spoke. Thomas continued working at his bonds, feeling the ropes gradually loosening. Miller stared into the dead campfire, his expression troubled. "Why did you partner with Holloway?" Thomas asked, finally breaking the silence. "You must have known what kind of man he is." Miller sighed heavily. "Necessity. When Margaret died and William disappeared with Eleanor, I had no idea where to begin searching. Holloway had a reputation for finding people who didn't want to be found." But you knew he had a vendetta against me. Not initially, Miller admitted. He presented himself as a professional tracker, nothing more. It was only after he located William's trail that he revealed his connection to you and to James's death. And by then you were committed, Thomas guessed. Miller nodded reluctantly. I've spent a lifetime building my business, Captain Blackwood. I've made difficult choices, compromised when necessary. I told myself this was no different, that the end justified the means. And now, the older man met Thomas's gaze directly. Now I find myself questioning whether I've become the very thing I despised in my son, a man willing to sacrifice a child's well-being for his own purposes. It was a startling admission, especially from a man of Miller's obvious pride. Thomas sensed an opening, a chance to reach the grandfather Ellie had never known. It's not too late, Thomas said quietly. You can still make different choices, better ones. Miller studied Thomas thoughtfully. Perhaps, but first I need to meet Eleanor, to see for myself that she's well, that she's happy. And if she wants to stay in Silver Creek with Clara, and Thomas hesitated, then committed himself. With me, would you respect that choice? You, Miller's eyebrows rose in surprise. You intend to remain in her life. I made a promise to James, Thomas said simply. I mean to keep it. Understanding dawned in Miller's eyes. So that's why you've tracked my family all these years. Not guilt, but honor. Both, Thomas admitted. They're not mutually exclusive. Before Miller could respond, Martinez called out a warning from his lookout position. Riders coming from the east. Miller stood quickly, moving to join the guard. Thomas redoubled his efforts with the ropes, feeling them finally giving way. If he could free himself during the distraction. The approaching riders crested the ridge, not Holloway returning, but Clara Montgomery on a bay horse, accompanied by a man in a military uniform. Thomas recognized the insignia of a cavalry lieutenant from Fort Grant. Clara reined in at the edge of the camp, her eyes quickly finding Thomas. Relief washed over her face, followed by determination as she noted his bound condition. Mr. Blackwood, she called, her voice steady despite the danger. I see you've met Ellie's grandfather. Miller stepped forward, his attention fixed on Clara. Miss Montgomery, I presume. Where is my granddaughter? Safe, Clara replied firmly. Beyond your reach, or Sergeant Holloway's. The lieutenant beside her added, and she'll remain that way, sir. I have orders to escort these civilians to Fort Grant and to arrest Vincent Holloway on charges of attempted murder and arson. Martinez raised his rifle, but Miller placed a restraining hand on his arm. No more violence. To Clara, he said, I only wish to meet her, to know she's well. Something in his tone, a genuine concern perhaps, or simple honesty, seemed to reach Clara. Her expression softened slightly. She is well, she confirmed, physically at least. Emotionally, she's still recovering from her father's betrayal. She doesn't need more upheaval in her life. Miller absorbed this, his face reflecting a complex mixture of emotions. I understand, but surely you can see that I have rights as her only living blood relative. Rights, Clara's voice sharpened. What of responsibilities? Where were you when Margaret was dying, when William was drinking himself into oblivion? Where were you when your granddaughter was learning to survive in a home without love? The accusations struck Miller like physical blows. He seemed to age before their eyes, his shoulders sagging under the weight of truths he couldn't deny. I was wrong, he admitted quietly. I cut William off when he married against my wishes. I was too proud to reach out even after James died. Too stubborn to acknowledge that my son had found happiness with a woman I deemed unsuitable. He looked up at Clara, his expression raw with regret. I have no excuse, Miss Montgomery, only a father's arrogance and an old man's loneliness. The naked honesty of his confession seemed to surprise even Miller himself. He turned away, composing himself with visible effort. In that moment of distraction, Thomas finally freed his hands. In one fluid motion, he rose and retrieved his Colt from where it had been placed on a nearby rock. Martinez started to raise his rifle, but froze when Thomas's revolver centered on his chest. Drop it, Thomas ordered calmly. Martinez glanced at Miller, who nodded resignedly. The guard lowered his weapon to the ground. Thomas, Clara called, relief evident in her voice. Are you hurt? Nothing serious, he assured her, moving to join her and the lieutenant while keeping his gun trained on Martinez. Where's Ellie? With Sheriff Palmer at Fort Grant, Clara replied. Lieutenant Cooper and his men arrived just after dawn, responding to the sheriff's telegram. When I explained the situation, he agreed to help me find you. Thomas nodded his thanks to the young officer. Holloway and 2 of his men are searching for you along the roads. They could return at any moment. My patrol is positioned to intercept them, Cooper informed him. We should move quickly, though. As Thomas prepared to mount behind Clara, Ezra Miller stepped forward, his bearing dignified despite his defeat. Captain Blackwood, he said formally, I would like to propose a truce. Allow me to accompany you to Fort Grant, to meet Eleanor under whatever conditions you deem appropriate. Thomas exchanged a glance with Clara, seeing his own uncertainty mirrored in her eyes. Could they trust this man who had partnered with Holloway, who had been willing to use his own granddaughter as bait? Yet Thomas had seen something change in Miller during their conversation, a softening, a recognition of past mistakes. And there was Ellie to consider. Didn't she deserve to know her grandfather to form her own opinion of the man? That's not my decision alone, Thomas said finally. Ellie has been through enough. We won't force another meeting on her if she's unwilling. Miller nodded, accepting the condition. Fair enough. I ask only for the chance to introduce myself to begin making amends if she'll allow it. Lieutenant Cooper frowned. Sir, my orders are to bring in anyone associated with Holloway. Mr. Miller is a witness, not an accomplice, Thomas stated firmly. He can provide testimony against Holloway and his men. After a moment's consideration, Cooper nodded. Very well, but he rides with me under guard. As they prepared to leave, the crack of a rifle shot echoed across the canyon. Martinez dropped to the ground, a crimson stain spreading across his chest. From the ridge above, Vincent Holloway appeared, his rifle aimed at the group below. Nobody move, he shouted, his voice carrying clearly in the morning air. The next shot goes through Miller's head, if any of you so much as twitch. Thomas cursed under his breath. Holloway must have doubled back, perhaps suspicious of Miller's true intentions. Now he held the high ground in a clear line of fire. It's over, Holloway, Thomas called back. The army's involved now. There's no way out for you. There's always a way out, Holloway replied, a dangerous edge to his voice. Miller? Get up here now. Bring Blackwood with you. The rest stay where they are. Miller straightened his shoulders, a decision visibly forming. No, he said clearly. This ends here, Sergeant. I won't be party to more bloodshed. Holloway's face contorted with rage. You gutless old man. After everything I've done to find your granddaughter, you're backing out now. I'm choosing a different path, Miller replied steadily. One that doesn't involve using a child as a pawn in your vendetta. The rifle in Holloway's hands shifted, centering on Miller's chest. Then you're no use to me anymore. Time seemed to slow as Thomas saw Holloway's finger tighten on the trigger. Without conscious thought, he lunged forward, pushing Miller aside as the rifle cracked. Pain exploded in Thomas's shoulder as the bullet meant for Miller's heart found a different target. Thomas fell hard, the world graying at the edges. He was vaguely aware of shouting, of Clara kneeling beside him, her hands pressing against the wound. More gunshots echoed, but they seemed distant, unimportant compared to the fire spreading through his shoulder and chest. Thomas, stay with me. Clara's voice reached him through the growing fog. Don't you dare leave us now. Us. The word registered dimly. Us meant Clara and Ellie, the family he had found unexpectedly, the connection he had resisted and now embraced. Promise, he managed to whisper before darkness claimed him. Thomas drifted in and out of consciousness, aware of movement of voices speaking urgently around him. He was being carried, then bouncing painfully in what felt like a wagon. Clara's voice remained a constant, sometimes reading, sometimes simply talking. He couldn't make out the words, but the sound anchored him, gave him something to hold on to in the darkness. Time lost meaning. There was pain, then blessed numbness. Light and shadow alternated without pattern. Throughout it all, Thomas clung to one thought: Ellie was safe. Whatever happened to him, he had kept his promise to James Miller. When awareness finally returned in full, Thomas found himself in a narrow bed, sunlight streaming through nearby windows. The room was unfamiliar, whitewashed walls, simple furniture, the smell of carbolic soap and clean linens. A military hospital, he realized. Fort Grant. He tried to sit up, only to be halted by a sharp pain in his left shoulder. Looking down, he saw his chest and shoulder wrapped in clean bandages. You shouldn't move yet, a soft voice admonished from beside the bed. The doctor says you need to stay still for at least another day. Clara Montgomery sat in a chair beside him, a book open in her lap. She looked tired but relieved, her usually neat hair slightly disheveled, her eyes shadowed with fatigue. How long? Thomas asked, his voice rough from disuse. 3 days, Clara replied, setting aside her book to pour him a glass of water. The bullet fractured your collarbone and nicked an artery. You lost a great deal of blood before we reached the fort. Thomas accepted the water gratefully, the cool liquid soothing his parched throat. Holloway. Dead, Clara stated flatly. Lieutenant Cooper shot him when he tried to fire again after you were hit. His men surrendered without further resistance. Thomas absorbed this news with mixed emotions. Holloway had been driven by grief and misplaced loyalty, not so different from Thomas himself in many ways. Under other circumstances, they might have found common ground instead of conflict. And Miller, he asked after a moment, here at the fort under nominal arrest, while the territorial marshal investigates his involvement with Holloway. Clara's expression softened slightly. He saved your life, Thomas. After you were shot, he helped me stanch the bleeding, used his own shirt for bandages. The doctor said that without his quick action, you likely wouldn't have survived. This revelation surprised Thomas. The Ezra Miller he had briefly known didn't seem the type to dirty his hands with another man's blood. Perhaps the old man was capable of change after all. Ellie, Thomas asked the question that mattered most. Clara smiled, the expression warming her face. Impatient to see you. She's been helping the fort school teacher during the day and sitting with you for an hour each evening, telling you about everything she's learning. Thomas felt a surge of affection for the resilient child who had somehow worked her way into his carefully guarded heart. She's met her grandfather. Clara nodded. Briefly, it was civil. Ellie was understandably wary but curious too. She has his eyes, you know, the same shade of green. And you, how are you holding up through all this? The question seemed to catch Clara off guard. She looked away, fidgeting with the pages of her book. I'm fine, concerned for you, of course, and for Ellie's well-being with all these changes. Thomas sensed there was more she wasn't saying, but he was too weak to press the issue. Instead, he asked, what happens now with Ellie, I mean? Clara sighed, meeting his gaze again. That's still being determined. Mr. Miller has legal claim as her closest blood relative, but given the circumstances of her discovery and his involvement with Holloway, the authorities are proceeding cautiously. And his intentions? He says he wants what's best for Ellie, whatever that may be. Clara's tone suggested skepticism. He's proposed a compromise of sorts, that Ellie remain in Silver Creek for the time being, with periodic visits from him as he establishes a relationship with her. Thomas considered this. It was more reasonable than he had expected from a man of Miller's obvious wealth and influence. You don't trust him, he observed. I'm reserving judgment, Clara replied diplomatically. He seems genuinely remorseful about his estrangement from William's family, and his actions since your injury have been above reproach. But he partnered with Holloway, used his granddaughter as bait, Thomas finished for her. Those aren't the actions of a man who prioritizes a child's welfare. Precisely. Clara stood smoothing her skirt with a gesture that spoke of nervous energy. The marshal has called a hearing for tomorrow to determine temporary guardianship arrangements. Mr. Miller has engaged a lawyer from Tucson. Thomas frowned. And Ellie, who speaks for her interests. I've been appointed her temporary guardian by the fort's commander, Clara said, and Sheriff Palmer has volunteered to represent her at the hearing once he's well enough to attend. Thomas nodded, relieved that Ellie would have advocates who truly cared for her well-being. I should be there too. Clara's expression turned stern. You should be resting and recovering. The doctor was quite clear about that. Before Thomas could argue, the door opened and Ellie herself appeared, her face lighting up when she saw Thomas awake. Mr. Blackwood, she exclaimed, rushing to the bedside. You're finally awake. I knew you would be today. I just knew it. Thomas couldn't help smiling at her enthusiasm. Hello, Ellie. I hear you've been keeping busy while I've been sleeping. The girl nodded eagerly. Lieutenant Cooper's wife is teaching the soldiers' children, and she let me help with the younger ones. And I've been reading to you every evening, even though you didn't seem to hear me. I heard you, Thomas assured her. Your voice helped bring me back. Ellie beamed at this, then grew more serious. Miss Montgomery says You got shot protecting my grandfather, is that true? Thomas glanced at Clara, who nodded slightly, encouraging honesty. Yes, that's true. Sergeant Holloway was going to shoot him, and I couldn't let that happen. Even though he worked with the bad man who hurt Sheriff Palmer. Even then, Thomas confirmed, your grandfather made mistakes, Ellie. Serious ones. But that doesn't mean he deserved to die. Ellie considered this with her characteristic thoughtfulness. He wants me to come live with him in Boston, she said finally. He has a big house with a library full of books. He says I could go to a special school for mathematics. Thomas felt his heart sink at her words. Of course, Miller would tempt her with books and education, the very things a bright child like Ellie would value most. That sounds wonderful, he managed to say, keeping his tone neutral. What do you think about his offer? Ellie's green eyes met his directly. I told him I'd think about it, but I also told him I don't want to leave Silver Trees, or you and Miss Montgomery. Her voice dropped to a near whisper. Is that ungrateful of me to not want to go with my only family? No, sweetheart, Clara said gently, placing a hand on Ellie's shoulder. Family isn't just about blood relations. It's about the people who care for you, who put your needs before their own. Like you and Mr. Blackwood did, Ellie stated with certainty. Yes, Clara agreed softly. Like we did. Thomas felt something shift in his chest at Clara's words, at the simple truth they contained. Somehow, against all odds and his own intentions, he had become part of something larger than himself. A family not of blood, but of choice and circumstance. Whatever happens at the hearing tomorrow, Thomas said, remember that you have people who care about you, Ellie. People who will continue to care, no matter where you live. Ellie nodded solemnly. I know, and I was thinking. She hesitated suddenly, shy. Maybe there's a way for everyone to be happy. What do you mean? Clara asked, curious. Well, Ellie began carefully. Grandfather wants me to have a good education and advantages. You and Mr. Blackwood want me to be safe and happy in Silver Creek. What if Grandfather helped build a bigger school in Silver Creek with more books and a special teacher for mathematics? Then I could stay with you, but still have the learning he wants for me. Thomas and Clara exchanged surprised glances. The child had cut through the complications of adult pride and legal maneuvering to propose a solution that addressed everyone's concerns. That's actually quite brilliant, Clara admitted. If Mr. Miller is sincere about wanting what's best for you rather than simply asserting his authority, he might be open to such an arrangement. It would benefit the entire town, Thomas added, warming to the idea. Not just Ellie, but all the children of Silver Creek. A discreet knock at the door interrupted their discussion. A young soldier appeared, looking somewhat apologetic. Pardon the intrusion, ma'am. Mr. Miller is asking if he might speak with Mr. Blackwood. Says it's important. Clara looked at Thomas, who nodded his assent. Send him in, but please let him know Mr. Blackwood is still recovering and shouldn't be overtaxed. As the soldier left to fetch Miller, Ellie stood up straighter, smoothing her dress in a gesture so reminiscent of Clara that Thomas had to hide a smile. Should I go? She asked, uncertain. That's up to you, Thomas told her. You're welcome to stay if you'd like. Ellie thought for a moment, then nodded decisively. I'll stay. Grandfather should know that we discuss things together like a family. The word family hung in the air, simple yet profound, as Ezra Miller entered the room. The older man had clearly made an effort with his appearance, despite his reduced circumstances. His suit, though no longer pristine, was neatly brushed, his gray hair combed, his bearing dignified. He faltered slightly upon seeing Ellie, as if her presence was unexpected. Eleanor, I didn't realize you would be here. I can return later if this is an inconvenient time. It's all right, Grandfather, Ellie replied with surprising poise. Mr. Blackwood and Miss Montgomery don't keep secrets from me. Miller's eyebrows rose at this, but he nodded his acceptance. Very well. That simplifies matters in a way. He turned to Thomas, his expression solemn. Captain Blackwood, I owe you my life, and an apology. My involvement with Holloway placed you, my granddaughter, and this entire community in danger. The frank admission surprised Thomas. You helped save my life as well, from what I'm told. Perhaps we can consider the debt settled. Miller shook his head. Not entirely. There's the matter of Eleanor's future to resolve. That's why I've come. He drew a folded document from his pocket. I've instructed my lawyer to withdraw my petition for guardianship at tomorrow's hearing. This announcement stunned them all into momentary silence. Clara recovered first. May I ask what prompted this decision, Mr. Miller? Miller's gaze shifted to Ellie, his expression softening. Several factors. My conversations with Eleanor these past days, observing her interactions with you and the children here at the fort, and he hesitated, then continued more quietly, remembering what family truly means. Something I lost sight of many years ago, to my lasting regret. He handed the document to Clara. This grants temporary guardianship to you, Miss Montgomery, with provision for my regular correspondence and visits to Eleanor should she wish them. It also establishes a trust for her education and future needs. Clara scanned the document, her expression changing from suspicion to cautious acceptance. This is very generous, Mr. Miller. But why? Because it's what Margaret would have wanted, he replied simply. She always put Eleanor's happiness above all else. I dishonored her memory by forgetting that. Ellie stepped forward, studying her grandfather with newfound interest. Did you know my mother well? Miller's composure cracked slightly. Not as well as I should have. I allowed prejudice to blind me to her true character. By the time I recognized my mistake, it was too late. He paused, visibly collecting himself. But she wrote to me once a year at Christmas, sent photographs of you. I kept them all. The admission clearly cost him, revealing a sentimentality at odds with his stern exterior. Thomas found his opinion of the man shifting, softening. Ellie had an idea, he said, drawing Miller's attention, about a way forward that might satisfy everyone's concerns. As Clara explained to Ellie's proposal for expanding educational opportunities in Silver Creek, Miller listened with growing interest. When she finished, he turned to his granddaughter with something like respect in his eyes. You have your mother's practical mind, he observed, and her gift for finding compromise where others see only conflict. Ellie blushed at the comparison but stood her ground. Would you consider it, grandfather? It would help not just me but all the children in Silver Creek. Miller nodded slowly. I would indeed. In fact, I'd expand on it. Silver Creek clearly needs a proper school building, not just a teacher and books. I could fund its construction, establish scholarships for promising students. A legacy, Clara suggested, in Margaret's name perhaps. The Margaret Miller Memorial School. Miller mused, genuine emotion crossing his face. She would have liked that. As they discussed details, Thomas found himself watching Clara and Ellie, the schoolteacher, who had opened her home and heart to an abandoned child, and the remarkable girl who had survived betrayal with her spirit intact. They had become his anchor, his reason to stop running from connection and responsibility. When Miller finally took his leave, promising to incorporate their suggestions into his discussions with the territorial authorities, an air of cautious optimism remained in the small hospital room. Do you think he means it? Clara asked Thomas quietly while Ellie examined a book the lieutenant's wife had lent her, about withdrawing his petition, supporting the school. I believe he does, Thomas replied. Men like Miller don't change easily, but when they do, it's a complete. He hesitated, then added, the question is, what happens next for us? Clara's eyes met his, understanding the deeper question. That depends on what you want, Thomas. Your postal route covers a wide territory. Silver Creek is just one stop among many. It could be more, he said softly, if I had reason to stay. A flush of color rose in Clara's cheeks. Are you asking if you have such a reason? I'm asking if you and Ellie would consider. Thomas faltered, the words he wanted to say suddenly lodged in his throat. After years of solitude, of careful distance from emotional entanglements, he found himself yearning for precisely what he had avoided. Clara saved him from his awkwardness. Yes, she said simply. We would, both of us. From her place by the window, Ellie looked up, her perceptive gaze moving between the two adults. A small, knowing smile curved her lips. Then she returned to her book, giving them the illusion of privacy. Thomas reached for Clara's hand, his calloused fingers entwining with hers. I made a promise, he said, to James, to myself, to care for his family. I intend to keep it. We'll help you, Clara replied, her voice steady but her eyes bright with emotion. It's easier to keep promises when you're not alone. Outside the window, the Arizona sun painted the distant mountains in shades of gold and purple. Inside, in a simple room at a frontier fort, three people who had been wounded by life in different ways began to heal together. Not a family formed by blood or law, but by choice and circumstance, and the quiet courage to trust again. Thomas Blackwood, who had spent years running from connection, finally found his way home in the most unexpected place, the hearts of a remarkable girl and the woman brave enough to stand beside them both. The promise made in blood and desperation on a Tennessee battlefield had led him here, to this moment, to this new beginning. Some promises, once made, had to be kept even when they led down trails as surprising and precious as the one that now stretched before him.